Good morning. My name is Debbie Hersman, and I'm the chairman of the National Transportation Safety Board. It's my privilege to welcome you to the boardroom this morning. This morning, I'm pleased to be joined by my fellow members, Vice Chairman Chris Hart and Member Robert Sumwalt. And I'd like to welcome our new colleagues, Member Mark Rosekind and Member Earl Weiner. They were sworn in on June 30th, and for those of you who are keeping track, it's been almost a year and a half since we've had a full board. I think I can speak for the Vice Chairman, Member Sumwalt, and all of our staff when I say we're very excited to welcome such technically qualified colleagues to the board, and we look forward to your participation today and in the coming years. Welcome. This morning, the board meets in open session as required by the Sunshine Act. While this is a public meeting, only the NTSB board members and our staff will participate in today's discussions. 3 weeks ago, the staff presented to the board the report that we are considering today, an aviation accident of a runway side excursion that occurred during attempted takeoff in strong and gusting crosswinds in Denver, Colorado. The individual board members have had the opportunity to read the accident report and to meet with staff. However, today is the first time that 5 board members are meeting to discuss it together. Staff has prepared 6 presentations, each of which will be followed by a round of questions from the board members. We will then consider the report's conclusion, probable cause, and recommendations. My fellow board members and I are dedicated to a thorough and objective investigation of every accident before the board. The rules governing our participation require impartiality to ensure such objective inquiries. I want to note that Member Weiner was employed by the Boeing Company between 1975 and 1999, and he now draws retirement benefits from the Boeing Company. We conferred with our designated agency ethics official regarding his ability to participate in these proceedings today. The DAO, our designated agency ethics officer, has reviewed Member Weiner's specific activities at Boeing with regard to the particular model of aircraft involved in this accident, as well as the potential impact of possible adverse findings on Boeing's ability to provide continued retirement benefits to its retirees. Our ethics official, consistent with guidance from the Office of Government Ethics, has determined that Member Weiner may participate in these proceedings. Accordingly, all board members are qualified to participate in today's board meeting. Because this is the actual deliberations of this board, it's possible that all or part of the report may be changed. It may be modified to reflect our discussion or any proposed amendments. 30 minutes after we conclude, copies of our abstract will be available in our press office. On the evening of December 20th, 2008, Continental Flight 1404, a Boeing 737-500 with 110 passengers and 5 crew members on board, many of whom were traveling to holiday destinations, began a flight that never departed Denver International Airport. This accident was the perfect storm of circumstances. Denver International Airport is a unique airport, over 50 square miles built on the prairie east of the Rocky Mountains, where the wind and weather are constantly changing and high winds are not infrequent. The evening of the accident, mountain wave conditions produced extreme wind conditions with strong intermittent gusts, recorded at 40 knots, and as we will discuss today, our investigation found that some peak gusts were even higher. Wind sensors placed throughout the airfield recorded the winds, and some sensors even recorded gust information, but only limited information was provided to the accident pilots. Not aware of how strong the winds really were, the accident captain departed down runway 34 right. During the takeoff roll, an extreme gust crossed the aircraft's path. The captain did not maintain directional control, and the aircraft veered left off the runway. It then traveled across the airfield, traversing changes in elevation, crossing a taxiway and a roadway before finally coming to rest. In darkness, all 110 passengers and crew members evacuated the burning aircraft. There were no fatalities. In this respect, this accident was nothing less than the holiday miracle that it was dubbed in the press in the days following the accident. However, as we will discuss today, this aircraft happened to be in the direct path of a perfect storm of circumstances that resulted in an unexpected excursion at an airport with one of the most sophisticated wind sensing systems in the country. Our purpose this morning is to discuss why and how this accident happened. We will examine a range of safety issues, like the pilot's actions, training, and experience, the air traffic control system, and how wind information is disseminated. We will look at runway selection and use, crosswind training and guidelines, and simulator modeling. When we talk about aviation safety, we often speak about redundancies and robustness. In light of today's report, one has to ask, is the system robust enough? Is the safety net strong enough and wide enough? What improvements can be made and must be made so that the passengers on board any aircraft, whether at Denver or another airport, take off and arrive safely at their destination? I look forward to finding out these answers today. Before we begin our discussion of the report, I have a few final comments. On behalf of my fellow board members and the NTSB staff, I welcome the passengers of 1404 who may be in our audience or watching this via live webcast. While we're thankful that no lives were lost, we recognize that many of you still may be recovering from your injuries, and our thoughts are with you. Thank you to the many individuals and organizations who assisted with the investigation, including those who responded immediately after the accident: police and first responders, airport personnel, government agencies, and so many others. Your support was invaluable. To the flight attendants of Continental 1404, thank you for following procedures and for responding as you were trained. Under your direction, 110 passengers evacuated the aircraft before the fire entered the cabin. You're a shining example of the things that went right that evening. I also extend the board's appreciation to Continental for their unprecedented cooperation in providing a review and summary of critical operational flight data that greatly benefited this investigation. In addition, we received assistance from Thales with understanding gust modeling in training simulators. Last week, as we were preparing for the board meeting, the vice chairman and I traveled to Denver. We met with the professionals at Denver International Airport, Denver TRACON, and the DIA Tower. And I'd like to recognize John Kenny, who's the Deputy Manager of Aviation at DIA, who's joining us in the boardroom today, as well as Rick Wunn, who's the manager at the Denver District TRACON. Both of their teams graciously helped our staff and the board members, taking time out of their busy schedules to answer our questions and help us better understand this accident. And lastly, I would like to recognize Member Sumwalt. Member Sumwalt served as the member on scene and was the party spokesperson for the team in Denver. His experience and leadership are invaluable to this agency. He has been the member on scene now at 9 major accidents, is that right? And this includes the launch with our Marine team last week, which they just returned from a few days ago, involving the tourist boat and the barge collision in the Delaware River near Philadelphia. Thank you for representing our agency so well. Now for the report. Dr. Meyer, will you please introduce the Safety Board staff?
Yes, ma'am. Good morning. To my right is John DeLisi, the Deputy Director of the Office of Aviation Safety. Sitting next to him is Bill English, the investigator in charge. Then Tim Birch, Aircraft Performance Group Chairman. Sitting next to Tim is Dr. Bill Bramble, Human Performance Group Chairman. And then at the end of the table, Don Ike, Meteorology Group Chairman. Seated behind Don is Jeff Marcus, Safety Recommendations. To Jeff's left is Dan Bartlett, Air Traffic Control Group Chairman. Then Mark George, Survival Factors Group Chairman. And to Mark's left, Jody Reeves, the report writer. Gary Halbert, our General Counsel. And finally, Tom Zoller, the Executive Officer. And I believe Bill English has the first presentation.
Thank you, David, Madam Chairman, and members of the board. On December 20th, 2008, at 6:18 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, Continental Flight 1404, a Boeing 737-500, departed the left side of runway 34 right during takeoff from Denver International Airport. The airplane was destroyed by impact forces and fire. There were 5 crew members and 110 passengers on board the scheduled flight to George Bush International Airport in Houston. There were 6 serious injuries, including the captain, and 41 minor injuries, including the co-pilot and 2 cabin crew. And Mr. George will discuss crew seat issues in a later presentation. At the time of departure, nighttime visual conditions prevailed, with a strong gusty crosswind from the west. The flight was departing to the north on runway 34 right, as were many other departures in this runway use configuration. This overview of the Denver airport shows the general operation at the time of the accident. The general wind direction is shown in red, and although the wind velocity was variable, as Mr. Ike will explain in his presentation. Denver had 4 north-south runways and 2 aligned east-west. Air traffic control was configured in a north and west operation in which departing aircraft used the west side of the airport, runways 34 left and right, and runway 25, all shown in green. And arrivals were assigned to the east runway complex, runways 35 left and right, and runway 26 indicated in blue. The accident airplane's path on runway 34 right is shown in yellow. On-scene evidence and FDR recordings indicate the airplane was appropriately configured for takeoff. The crew received a wind advisory of 270 degrees at 27 knots, and the initial takeoff roll appeared normal. As the airplane accelerated, control inputs generally appropriate to a left crosswind were being applied by the captain. As the airplane passed through about 80 knots, a series of large, rapid rudder inputs were made and promptly relaxed. Just below 100 knots, as the rudder input was reducing, the airplane's nose swung sharply left. As the airplane left the center line, the pilot nearly neutralized the rudder input and made aileron input opposite the appropriate crosswind correction, and there was evidence the pilot used the nose wheel tiller just prior to exiting the runway. The motion is the result of a natural tendency of airplanes in a crosswind called weather vaning, in which the crosswind forces cause the airplane to point into the wind unless there are counteracting control inputs by the pilot. Dr. Bramble will have more details on the pilot's control use in his presentation. I would like to present a short video which will help depict the rapid sequence of events. This video was captured during a simulator session that the investigative team participated in at Boeing. A full-motion simulator called MCAB was configured to backdrive or to use the FDR data from the accident airplane to duplicate as best possible the airplane and control motions in order to help aid investigators in understanding the pilot's actions and perceptions. The video includes an overview of the participants inside the simulator, and note that the participants could only feel along with the controls and were not making any inputs of their own. This section is an excerpt of the view the participants would have through the simulator windscreen and an inset of the rudder and control yoke positions. You'll be able to see the small incremental corrections made by the pilot as the airplane begins accelerating on the takeoff roll. And at about 75 knots, you'll see the first of the large rudder inputs, then relaxed, and about 90 knots, the second input. And as the heading diverges, the rudder neutralizes and the yoke transitions to full right. The airplane left the runway at about 119 knots, and the crew reduced engine power a few seconds later, while passing through snow-covered grassy ground, crossing a taxiway and service road, and coming to rest behind one of the firehouses. A fuel-fed fire began in the vicinity of the right wing root and consumed most of the right side of the fuselage. Examination of the aircraft revealed no evidence of locked brakes, rudder system issues, or other relevant pre-existing mechanical conditions. A fractured nose wheel steering cable was found to have occurred due to impact forces. An aircraft performance study was conducted to determine if the recently installed winglets may have been a factor, and it was concluded that they had negligible effect on crosswind performance. The study further examined the control authority of the airplane and extracted the wind velocity acting upon the control surfaces during the takeoff roll. Mr. Birch will have further details on the performance study during his presentation. Further, there was no indication of any pre-accident crew impairment of any kind or any history of crew performance deficiencies. Safety issues identified in this accident include the pilot's actions, training, and experience, ATC obtaining and disseminating wind information, runway selection and use, crosswind training for pilots, especially as involves the gusting wind models used in simulators, crosswind guidelines used for aircraft certification and operational limits, and certification and inspection of crew seats and galley latches. Staff has proposed recommendations in all these areas. Parties to the investigation included the Federal Aviation Administration, Continental Airlines, Boeing, the Airline Pilots Association, Denver International Airport, the National Air Traffic Controllers Association, GE SNECMA Engines, the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, Aviation Partners Boeing, and the BEA of France provided an accredited representative as state of manufacturer of the SNECMA engines. Additionally, the National Center for Atmospheric Research assisted with wind modeling. A full GO team was launched with Member Sumwalt as the member on scene, and I would like to take a moment to recognize all the staff who participated in the investigation. Okay. That concludes my opening presentation, and do you have any questions?
Thank you very much, Mr. English, and I know you've had quite a busy year. You were just here a couple months ago with the Columbia Learjet overrun, and you've been on quite a few international launches, and so I know you've had a busy plate, as many have at the board. So thank you for leading the team on this investigation. Member Sumwalt, do you have any questions? No, thank you. Member Weiner. Member Rosekind. Vice Chairman Hart.
Thank you, Mr. English. I just had a question about the report from the controller, 270, wind 270, 27 knots. Was there any reference to gusts in that report of the winds?
In that radio transmission, there was not, and Mr. Bartlett will have details on air traffic issues in his presentation.
Okay, then for his edification, I'll have the same question about the ATIS report and whether it mentioned gust as well.
Very good.
Mr. English, is it possible to pull up the animation and just kind of have a still of it? I had a question about what we're seeing here. On the upper right-hand corner, it looks like kind of looks like feet.
That's right.
What is that showing us?
Those would be the rudder pedal positions.
Where is neutral?
If you're looking at the still right now, the right rudder pedal would be one horizontal line lower, and the left rudder pedal would be one horizontal line higher. So basically even with the horizontal portion of the control yoke. And when we see the large excursion on the right rudder pedal, the left rudder pedal comes back. Correct.
That doesn't mean he's applying anything. It's just he's giving right rudder, and so the left rudder pedal is going to automatically come back at an opposite amount.
That's correct.
Okay. So the actual pressure is on the one that's going to be traveling forward.
That's correct. You apply pressure inwards, and then the opposite pedal just automatically comes back and presses against you a little bit.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think we're ready for the next presentation.
Okay, thank you. The next, Mr. Birch will have a presentation on vehicle performance factors, and we will segue directly into human performance factors due to the overlap in the presentations. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. English, Madam Chairman, and board members. Good morning.
Could you pull your mic just a little closer?
I will be presenting the results of the investigation and study conducted by the Airplane Performance Group. This included an estimate of the winds that existed during most of Continental Flight 1404's takeoff attempt. Data from numerous sources were used in the airplane performance study. Sources included the onboard data recorders, data from the Denver Airport Movement Area Safety System, or AMAS, the meteorological factual report, and information collected during the on-scene portion of the investigation. A primary objective of the Airplane Performance Group was to reconcile the airplane dynamics recorded on the flight data recorder with both the pilot's inputs, or column, wheel, pedal, and power, with the atmosphere, or the winds. This required an estimate of the winds, which are not recorded on the FDR. Another input that is not recorded on the flight data recorder is the nose wheel tiller. Tiller is a primary airplane control on the ground and is typically used at speeds less than 20 knots. Tiller is not recommended for use above 30 knots. Calculating the winds acting on the airplane presented a challenge for the Airplane Performance Group. This was the first time that the NTSB has extracted local winds on the ground where gear reaction forces and ground effect can complicate the problem. This figure depicts how the airplane is normally controlled. Pilot and atmospheric inputs act on the airplane and result in dynamics which are recorded on the flight data recorder. However, in the case of Continental Flight 1404, and as was previously stated, the winds and the nose wheel tiller inputs were unknown. The unknowns are shown in red in the figure. To estimate the winds in the tiller, the normal flow was reversed using an inverse simulation. Data recorded on the FDR and a 737-500 airplane simulation were used to back out the tiller and the winds present in Denver around the time of the accident. Before presenting the wind estimate, I would like to say a few words on the winglets that are installed on Continental 737-500 airplanes. Early in the investigation, there were concerns about the effect that the winglets may have on airplane ground handling. In order to increase fuel efficiency, Continental installed winglets on its 737-500 fleet over the 18 months preceding the accident. However, it was determined that the winglets have a negligible effect on crosswind capability and were not considered a factor in the accident. The airplane performance investigation also considered the effects of a dorsal that was added to all 737s subsequent to the -200 model. In contrast to the winglet, the dorsal has a significant effect on crosswind capability. The dorsal significantly increases the weather evading effect mentioned during Mr. English's presentation, especially at large side slip angles. It also increases the rudder effectiveness, which the pilot relies on to control the airplane during crosswind takeoffs. The airplane simulation used in the wind extraction included the effect of the dorsal on airplane ground handling. The wind extraction window was somewhat limited because airspeed was not recorded on the FDR until the airplane reached an airspeed of 40 knots. This occurred at about 18.0. In addition to FDR airspeed, the gear model used in the simulation has limitations with respect to skidding. As a result, the airplane drift angle was limited to 4 degrees, and this occurred about 14 seconds later. This limited the entire wind extraction to about 14 seconds. However, of particular interest was the wind around the time of the 2 large rudder pedal inputs at 8 seconds and 12 seconds. The airplane departed the runway at approximately 17.5 seconds after the airspeed came alive. As this figure indicates, the wind extraction identified a peak wind gust on the order of 45 knots, about the time the second large rudder input started coming out. The FDR data show that the airplane tracked the baseline or targeted heading within a degree or two until the right pedal was relaxed to approximately 30% of the total available as the wind speed was actually increasing. At this point, the airplane turned toward the left side of the runway at approximately 2 degrees per second and departed the runway approximately 4 seconds later. No rudder input above 30% was recorded beyond this point in the takeoff attempt. However, the airplane had sufficient rudder available to maintain the desired track. Finally, for contrast, the FAA certification requirement for demonstrated crosswinds, or the winds actually experienced during flight tests, is presented. The regulations require that manufacturers demonstrate a minimum of 20 knots. Crosswind, but not necessarily more than 25 knots. There is no requirement to demonstrate airplane ground handling in gusty conditions. On the 737, Boeing demonstrated 31 knots for the airplane without winglets. Aviation Partners Boeing, or APB, demonstrated 22 knots for the airplane with winglets. Beyond the demonstrated crosswind, the airplane manufacturer may provide supplemental guidelines that are based on analysis and that may actually exceed the demonstrated values. For example, Boeing's guideline for the 737 on a dry runway is 40 knots. One potential problem with analysis in the case of crosswinds is that it relies on model data at extremes in the flight envelope. For example, large rudder deflections, large side slip angles, and large drift angles. The flight test data needed to validate the models at these extremes are often limited. The other potential problem with analysis is in the modeling of the gust, and in the case of desktop analysis, the pilot. Industry still struggles with a mathematical representation in these areas, and both are required to accurately predict crosswind capability. In the case of the 737, gust effects were initially considered by Boeing, but were not included in the 40-knot guideline. Boeing concluded that while gusts increase the pilot workload, they do not significantly affect the recommended crosswind guideline. Staff has proposed recommendations in this area. That concludes my presentation, and if there are no questions, Dr. Bramble will now discuss crosswind training, guidelines, and limitations.
I think we probably do have questions, but do you want to proceed to the next presentation and then we'll take all questions after Dr. Bramble's?
I think that's a good approach.
Okay.
Good morning. My presentation examines the captain's experience and history, his control inputs during the accident sequence, crosswind training and guidelines, and applications for operational flight data. The captain, who served as the pilot flying during the attempted takeoff, was experienced with over 13,000 hours total flight time. He had over 6,000 hours of experience in the Boeing 737, and he had flown over 900 hours in the previous 12 months. His performance was described favorably by his peers, and company records revealed no prior performance deficiencies. Evidence collected during the investigation indicated that the captain's performance was not affected by medical issues, toxicological impairment, personal stress, or fatigue. During a normal takeoff, the relative wind is aligned with the airplane's fuselage, but when a crosswind is present, the relative wind is shifted to one side. This gives the airplane a tendency to weather vane or turn into the wind. Because a high crosswind was present during the attempted takeoff, the captain had to use considerable right rudder to counteract the weather vane effect. This graph shows rudder pedal, represented by the black line, and airplane heading, represented by the red line. Note that the red line is not a depiction of the airplane's ground track. As the airplane accelerated, the captain slowly advanced the right pedal, and heading changed very little. The captain advanced the pedal further, and the airplane's nose moved to the right. The captain relaxed the pedal, and the nose moved to the left. The captain made another large right pedal input, and this time the left turn slowed but then resumed. One of the pilots, likely the captain, made an exclamation. Immediately after the exclamation, the captain turned the control wheel and tiller to the right and did not make any more substantial pedal inputs. This graph shows airspeed, represented by the red line, and vertical acceleration, represented by the black line, a few seconds before and after the runway side excursion. As shown in the graph, the flight crew experienced increased vertical accelerations after the airplane left the runway. About 3 seconds after the excursion, the captain pulled the thrust levers back to reduce power. About a second after that, he called for a rejected takeoff. The captain's power reduction occurred 5.75 seconds after he began to manipulate the tiller, at which time, according to his interview, he was already having difficulty steering the airplane. The British Air Accidents Investigation Branch conducted a simulator study to examine pilot response to a frozen control column at V1. When faced with an apparent flight control failure, pilots initiated a rejected takeoff in an average of 2.7 seconds, with a range of 1.5 to 4 seconds. The captain's response was beyond this range. The captain's simultaneous use of tiller and control wheel required him to take his right hand off the thrust levers during this interval, and staff estimates that his initiation of a rejected takeoff was delayed about 2 to 4 seconds by his simultaneous manipulation of tiller and application of right control wheel, both of which were ineffective for steering the airplane. A review of operational data from 2 major airlines revealed that it is extremely rare for flight crews to encounter a crosswind component of 30 knots or greater during a takeoff. In fact, this only occurred during approximately 1 in 15,000 takeoffs. The accident flight crew encountered a component of 30 to 45 knots. It is very likely, therefore, that the accident crosswind exceeded the captain's line flying experience. Continental Airlines routinely included crosswind takeoffs in its recurrent training program. However, the crosswind component was generally much lower than the accident crosswind. During the 2004-2005 recurrent training year, pilots received training in the performance of high crosswind takeoffs. These takeoffs, however, were performed in a steady direct crosswind of 35 knots. In fact, the simulator used for the high crosswind takeoff training was not programmed to simulate wind gusts at ground level. Therefore, the crosswind encountered by the accident airplane, which was very gusty and ranged from 30 to 45 knots, exceeded the captain's prior training experience. Staff has proposed recommendations in this area. As Mr. Birch explained, various crosswind guidance figures are available for the Boeing 737. The demonstrated crosswind component is based on the successful performance of 3 takeoffs and landings during the airplane certification process. The actual demonstrated crosswind for the non-wingleted version of the 737 Classic series ranges from 31 to 36 knots. The value published in the airplane flight manual is 35 knots. In 1996, Boeing published supplemental guidelines for the 737 that included a 40-knot recommended maximum crosswind component for takeoff on uncontaminated runway surfaces. Continental Airlines selected a relatively conservative guideline of 33 knots for its 737 fleet. The aircraft certification process does not require manufacturers to demonstrate takeoff performance in very gusty winds, and manufacturers do not generally publish information about the gust factor that was present during certification flight testing. Although Boeing has published a supplemental crosswind guideline that exceeds demonstrated values, there are no FAA standards for the development of such guidelines. Boeing's enhanced 40-knot crosswind guideline was established without pilot-in-the-loop testing to evaluate the perceived takeoff handling qualities in very gusty conditions. Staff has proposed recommendations in this area. The FAA participates with airlines in a collaborative, voluntary safety program that involves the collection and analysis of operational flight data. Such data can be linked to airport, runway, and weather information. This type of analysis could allow the FAA to learn more about the context in which very high crosswind component takeoffs are occurring and the extent to which they are a safety hazard. The resulting information could help the FAA identify strategies to reduce the frequency of high crosswind takeoffs, thereby reducing the risk of crosswind-related runway excursions. Staff has proposed a recommendation in this area. This concludes my presentation, and we will be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Bramble. Member Sumwalt.
Thank you. The chairman mentioned that this was the perfect storm, and it's the perfect windstorm, that is. On some areas of the airport, the winds were light and out of the east, and yet, as this airplane rolled down runway 34 right at the instant that they're going down the runway, there was a gust of 45 knots. 45 knots, that's about 51 miles per hour. So that's a lot of wind. As the chairman mentioned, this accident has a lot of aspects, and I look forward to discussing those aspects with my colleagues today. Speaking of which, I join the chairman in saying that I personally look forward to a productive and collegial relationship with the two of you, in addition to the chairman and the vice chairman. So we do have a great board right here, and I'm proud to be a part of it. Let me ask you this. Was alcohol testing performed on the first officer?
It was not.
And why not?
The airline provided information to us indicating that they sent a team to the hospital where the rest of the flight crew was taken after the accident, and emergency crews had transported the first officer to a different hospital, and they were unable to locate him that night. And they did find him by the next morning and tested him at 8:30, or collected specimens at 8:30, but because it had been more than 8 hours, the regulations indicate don't test for alcohol.
I understand. Thank you. We do typically note that when it's not done, and I'm sure there's a good reason for it in each case, but we are concerned when it's not done in a timely fashion. I understand he was in the hospital, but I just wanted to follow up on that. Thank you. Page 56 of the draft report states, and I quote, "Performance calculations indicated that the airplane's rudder was capable of providing enough aerodynamic forces to offset the weather vaning tendencies created by the winds the airplane encountered during the takeoff roll." End of quote. Explain how we came up with that finding, please.
If I could go to a backup slide. Aaron, that's 14? The effect of wind on the airplane manifests itself as side slip. The side slip based on the wind extraction results is shown in green on this slide. The figure shows that the airplane actually experienced a smaller side slip angle during the second large rudder input at around 1812. The airplane was accelerating and the airspeed was greater during the second input. The higher airspeed resulted in a smaller side slip angle. As a result, it is likely the airplane would not have departed the runway had the captain immediately reapplied the rudder that was available as the airplane started its left turning motion to the side of the runway. So the answer is largely in the side slip angle. And with the increasing airspeed, the side slip angle was coming down. So he actually would have been better off in the second during the second rudder input.
So staff believes that if the right rudder had been maintained at the appropriate intensity or the appropriate application, the airplane would have stayed on the runway. Is that correct?
Maintained or come back in, yes. Reapplied.
Thank you. The report says that, draft report states that 1818 and 06.7, the captain made large and rapid right rudder pedal input. Does staff believe that the magnitude of these inputs may have been too much and too rapid, thus making it more challenging for the captain to subsequently control the aircraft?
We think that pilot technique may be an important factor determining the controllability of the aircraft in very strong and gusty crosswinds. We don't have data to examine precisely which patterns of pilot control input would be the most effective in these conditions, but we suspect that perhaps very large amplitude slow inputs might make the situation a little bit more difficult.
You feel that, I want to make sure I heard that right, that smaller, less rapid inputs would make the aircraft less difficult to control?
Well, it's difficult to say for certain, but possibly actually smaller, higher frequency inputs. We did receive some data on comparison high crosswind takeoffs from Continental Airlines, and we saw a variety of rudder use patterns. Some of them were slow and very large amplitude, others were large amplitude and very rapid, and some were lower amplitude and very rapid. The thing that's a little bit difficult to tell is we can't tell to what extent the changes in crosswind velocity were driving those patterns and the need to correct it in different ways, and to what extent those patterns represented individual pilot technique. That's what more data would help us sort out.
Thank you very much.
Member Weiner.
You stated the Boeing company provided guidelines for crosswind limitations of 40 knots. What's that limitation based on?
They termed it a guideline, and it was a supplemental value published in 1996 for crosswind takeoff. They started with the demonstrated crosswind value of 35 knots and then performed a mathematical engineering simulation where the most adverse engine was failed at V1, and a math pilot applied up to full rudder to bring the nose to the center of the runway. And if the rudder had sufficient authority to bring the nose to the center line, then it was considered to be an acceptable crosswind guideline. But the 40-knot crosswind was completely steady and did not include any gusts.
Okay, so the 40-knot crosswind was based on an engine-out situation?
Yes.
The rudder inputs in this case consisted of a couple of large pulses, about 4 seconds apart. Is there some interaction between that kind of input and the airplane's natural weather vaning dynamics that could exacerbate the controllability of the airplane?
I believe that you're getting at the sort of aircraft pilot coupling issue. There is a body of research looking at the stability of airplane handling tasks based on the dynamics of pilot plus airplane. The most well-researched and easy to define are the oscillatory type 1 pilot-induced oscillations. This accident did not clearly indicate those characteristics because there were not increasingly large oscillations in heading. Rather, there seemed to be very small changes in heading followed by a large and rapid departure, which shares some characteristics with the Class 3 type of aircraft pilot coupling event, but this category of sudden cliff-like events is not as well defined, and it's a little bit tougher to evaluate.
Okay, thank you.
Member Roskine.
First, I noticed besides questions, people make comments. So I'm just going to say thank you for the very warm welcome from all of the board colleagues and staff who've just been tremendous in welcoming the new members. Thank you so much for that. I notice the events are timed very exactly, and I'm wondering regarding the pilot, if you can make a comment about what role you think time pressure, situational assessment, decision-making, had on the pilot's actions and timing of those actions?
Well, for the majority of the takeoff role, the pilot was engaged in a tightly coupled manual control task. It would be described as a compensatory tracking task, and he was performing with a very small degree of error. When things started to get a little hairy and the aircraft maybe was not quite doing what he might have expected, we think that he experienced a very rapid elevation in stress. And there's literature you're probably aware of on decision-making that indicates when people become very stressed, their decision-making, the nature of their decision-making changes. It can become characterized by less consideration of alternatives and sped up action and sort of impulsively latching on to the first strategy that comes to mind, and because of narrowing of attention that occurs under stress. The other thing that tends to happen is because of the reduced controlled processing capability that people have under stress, they tend to revert to very well-learned behaviors because that requires less conscious attention. In this case, as the captain perceived that he was losing control, he latched on to the tiller and the control wheel to the right, which were methods that were appropriate for turning the airplane in other phases of flight, but not during the takeoff roll.
Thank you.
Vice Chairman.
You mentioned that the dorsal fin significantly increases the weather vaning propensity, and also that's the bad news. The good news is it also increases the rudder effectiveness. Do you know whether these 35 knot and 40 knot numbers that Boeing put out were from 7.3s with dorsal fins or not?
I believe Boeing did include the dorsal for the numbers that you're hearing that we're quoting.
And on the general issue of pilot-induced oscillation, I guess I'd be interested in sort of a general background. I guess this is a question for Dr. Bramble. General, if you have any sense of to what extent is the concept of pilot-induced oscillation understood in a ground yawing situation like we have here. It sounds to me like there's a real paucity of data in that respect. Is that accurate, or is it how well understood is this concept in this context?
Well, when it comes to oscillatory instability, the sort of type 1 PIO, the classic to which I think you're referring, there are some criteria for evaluating pilot vehicle stability that have to do with things like phase lag. And those techniques work fairly well for situations where you have increasing oscillatory instability of a flight parameter. In this case, there was less of that, and the models and the criteria are less well developed for these sort of sudden cliff-like type of events.
Are there any regulatory guidelines on this in this respect regarding limitations? How much can there be? How much is permissible? That sort of thing.
There are a range of criteria used during the development process, the certification and flight test process, some of which are subjective and some of which are mathematical engineering criteria. I think the use of these mathematical models to examine the potential for oscillatory instability is more widespread in the military aircraft development process. But these tendencies are typically discovered during flight tests if they exist on the civil side as well.
Okay, and one last question. It was interesting, your comment about reverting to, in time of stress, reverting to, I forgot exactly what you said, but reverting to
well-learned response strategies.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if turning the wheel to the right was sort of a reversion to driving. When you want to go right, you turn the wheel right. Is that?
It could be. It's hard to know for certain, but in addition to driving, you also can turn the airplane to the right in the air. And under conditions of extreme stress, you may latch on to behaviors that may be appropriate in another context, such as after rotation, that may not be appropriate in this context.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bramble. Can you please explain the difference between guidelines and limitations?
A guideline is a number that is sort of used as a reference value, but is not considered to be a hard limit by operators or pilots. And a limitation is a criteria that is not to be exceeded in normal operations.
And who's the best entity to determine guidelines or limitations? Who has the data and the information to do that?
Well, I believe industry's current approach is for the manufacturer to come up with guidelines and limitations. Actually, limitations have to be developed during the certification process. But then when it comes to numbers that are not hard guidelines, it's left to operators to tailor the guidelines to their own operating environment and pilot population. Ideally, development of guidelines and limitations should be based on data, and some are easier to develop than others because some depend on the calculation of fairly deterministic outcomes like stopping distance, whereas others, such as controllability, may depend on a wider range of factors and may not be as clear-cut.
Do all manufacturers establish guidelines or limitations consistently for crosswind takeoffs?
No.
Is that information conveyed to operators in the same way?
I don't believe there's a standard way to either develop supplemental guidelines or disseminate it.
Do the operators have a consistent way then to change? So, for example, in this case, Boeing had supplemental information that came out in the mid-90s that said they could go to 40 based on some extrapolation that they did from the demonstrated tests from 31 to 36 knots. And then Continental chose 33 knots as their guideline for their employees. Do other carriers come up with the same type of information, and what are those carriers basing that information on?
I believe it's a subjective assessment from the standpoint of the carriers. There have been surveys, or at least one survey done comparing operator guidelines to demonstrated values, and the finding of that survey was that the majority of operators choose guidelines at or below the demonstrated values. I'm not aware of any studies examining operator policies with respect to supplemental guidelines.
And with respect to what's demonstrated in those tests, the 31 to 36 crosswind, and we don't have a gust component on that, correct?
That's correct. The figure is an average wind, and gust effects are not reported.
And when these demonstrations, these tests are done, what's the circumstances in which they're done? Is it unexpected? Is it planned? Are they looking for wind? Are they measuring the wind? Are they trying to achieve this? Is it with test pilots? Is it with line pilots? Where are these demonstrations taking place?
It's largely all of the above. The tough part of crosswind testing is finding the crosswind. Nature has to cooperate. So when they have the airplanes ready to be launched into these crosswinds, they're instrumented. They're basically on their own go team, ready to go to locations within certain distance to go. They have the instrumentation to measure the winds, and they conduct these tests, the three that Dr. Bramble outlined. They are flight test pilots, but they also are trained to look at it from, or try to look at it from the perspective of a line pilot. So they do make considerations as to, with respect to how much rudder they should be using, how much control wheel they should be using, and so forth.
Are there standards for that?
I don't think those standards are as clear cut. I think that's, that these test pilots go through test pilot school. They do get this training. They are taught that, they are testing airplanes that are going to go out in the fleet, and they try to consider that. But I don't think it's a clear cut guideline they have for doing that.
Okay. And is that information or the techniques that are used in those demonstrated tests, are those conveyed to the operators for the line pilots to understand?
I think they're conveyed in the form of the flight manuals, the pilot operating handbooks and the flight manuals that Boeing produces for the 737 in this case.
Thank you. Member Somewhat.
Thank you. In my meeting with staff last week and in my memo that I wrote last week, I'd suggested that we need more clear and consistent guidance from the manufacturers to the pilots flying the airplanes, and staff did provide me with some documentation that it appeared that the guidance that was out there was fairly clear. And I read the guidance, and I'd say, yeah, that's clear as mud. But I'm wondering, can we do better with training pilots how to take off and land in crosswind conditions? Just because we have words in a book, is that sufficient training to properly prepare them for the magnitude of crosswinds that we're talking about here, 33, 35 knot crosswinds?
I think we can definitely do better. This is a manual control task, and I think exposing pilots to a realistic environmental simulation with very gusty crosswinds would allow them to develop better skills.
Okay, thanks. And the reason I say 33 or 35 is because those were the limits that were on the airplane according to Continental, 33 knots. I'm not sure we can really train people for winds of 45 knots and 50 knots, although I do think that some of the pilots in our operational study did practice with a 60 knot crosswind or something. But speaking of the operational simulator study that the ops group did at Continental Airlines, did that simulator simulate gusts when you did your simulator trials?
It did not.
Okay, and it was a limitation on the simulator, right?
Correct.
That the Continental simulator did not simulate gusts below, I think, 50 feet.
That's true.
Is that, so we have a draft finding that states that Continental simulator training did not replicate ground level disturbances and gusting crosswinds that often occur near the runway surface. Do we believe that this is just limited, that this was just Continental Airlines that didn't adequately simulate gust, or do we feel that this is more of an issue with flight simulators across the industry?
Well, I think it is probably limited to Continental simulator, but in terms of what other operators are doing with their training facilities is really an unknown. This is an area that I think industry struggles with, the gust models, the atmospheric models, as well as asking the airplane models, the gear models, the aerodynamic models at these extremes we talked about earlier, where it's hard to collect flight test data. The models are fuzzier out there, so the quality of training could probably be improved on if industry looked at it.
Okay, I want to make sure I understand you, because you're saying that you think it is just limited to Continental, but then you said, but it's probably at other airlines as well.
When I referred to Continental, the 50-foot issue where they turned off gusts below 50 feet AGL above the ground is most likely just manifested in the Continental simulator. But beyond that, I think the gust models that they failed to turn on, I don't know that they're accurate in other simulators, even if they're on it below 50 feet. So I think that's the larger issue.
Okay, so you're thinking that the aerodynamic models, the air mass models, the gust models themselves aren't widely known, so therefore they can't be distributed and used at other airlines. Correct, basically?
Correct. The airplane models, the gear models, they need to be looked at to make sure that they're giving true answers out at these extremes.
Thank you. Why did Continental turn off the gust models below 50 feet?
I can't answer that. I think it was a surprise to them as well.
Can I just add, Member Sumwalt, I think that generally staff feels that this is an industry-wide problem, that there's been insufficient attention to the modeling of gusts in crosswind takeoff and landing training, and we don't have any data to suggest that Continental is unique in this respect.
Thank you. I have one final question, if I could get a short answer. What do you mean there's a recommendation that was modified on Friday? What does staff mean by pilot in the loop testing?
What we referred to there had to do with the development of supplemental guidelines, and we feel that using a mathematical simulation with a math pilot to apply rudder after engine failure V1 is not sufficient to evaluate the handling qualities in a crosswind situation. So in addition to seeing gusty wind profiles examined when establishing supplemental guidelines, we'd like to see actual pilot-in-the-loop testing to evaluate the interaction between human control strategies and the airplane performance.
Thank you. No further questions.
Member Weiner.
The simulations, as we just discussed, had no gust component to the crosswind. And I think most people would agree that steady state crosswind would be simpler to handle than a crosswind with a gust imposed on top of it. Are there any reasonable, well understood models for the gustiness of the crosswind?
I believe the existing models are based on sort of random distributions, but I'll allow Mr. Birch to elaborate on that.
To answer your question directly, there are models out there for gusts, but I think that's also an area that we have recommendations in. We think that industry needs to look at that, revisit, for example, the NASA Dryden gust model to see if it can be improved upon and maybe make something more standard.
Is it safe to say that most of the gust models are really free space models, not models where you have the ground as a surface constraining the model?
I would say that's true.
So then the gust spectrum for a crosswind would be different than a gust spectrum for a typical gust model.
If I may add, Dr. Weiner, the recommendation that staff is proposing begins with gathering data on surface winds at major airports so that better understanding of those ground winds can be understood.
So that leads into building a better model using empirical data. Good, thank you.
And I'd just like to follow up on that. I do think that you talked about crosswind versus, I guess, ground wind or something. I think these models typically are white Gaussian shaped noise, and then they can be put down an axis system for a crosswind or a headwind and so forth. But it's all of this that I think we need to revisit to see if today we can do a better job.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Member Rosekind.
Briefly, your description of the difference between a guideline and limitation is very useful. Can you just make a brief comment about how a guideline would be used and other factors, basically, a pilot would use in their decision-making as opposed to the clarity of a limitation?
Well, guidelines, I believe the section in the flight crew operating manual or the Continental's AFM says something like, this is not a limitation, it can depend on pilot experience and other factors. And when we interviewed numerous pilots at Continental Airlines and asked them about guidelines, the responses to the question, would you exceed this guideline in inline flying, sort of ran the full range. We had people saying that I would not go up to the guideline. We had some people saying I would go to the guideline but no further, and we had a very small number of people who said they would feel comfortable going beyond the guideline. So it really depends on an individual's judgment. The thing that's a little bit concerning about it is that we didn't get the sense that pilots had an accurate understanding of their own exposure to actual high crosswind components. When we compared what we were told when interviewing people with the data that we saw that showed that crosswind components over 30 knots were extremely rare.
Thank you. And from a human performance perspective, I'm wondering, we have an extremely rare event, the amount of actual training experience in this particular situation, the time pressure, the decision-making requirements, the available data. while clearly your performance study showed that it was possible to control the aircraft in this particular accident circumstance, do we have any data to show not just possible, but how probable it was?
We don't, and that's the difficulty with assessing controllability in these type of conditions. It's going to be, ideally, you'd have sort of a probability of success kind of figure based on empirical testing. And we don't really have that database to draw upon in assessing the likelihood of a successful outcome in these conditions.
Thank you.
Vice Chairman.
I'm just curious about the lack of crosswind in the simulator. Is there any sense of whether that's because it's technologically difficult to do it, or just because we don't have the database as the foundation to establish what that is going to be like in a simulator, or is it both?
I think it's both. In the case of Continental simulator, they turn off gusts below 50 feet on the ground. And in other simulators, I don't think there is a universally accepted gust model, and that's an area that we have made recommendations in.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Bramble, have we investigated other accidents where we've seen loss of directional control and perhaps tiller use by the pilot?
We did investigate one accident years ago on a snowy runway where someone began to use the tiller at relatively low speeds, making the order of 40 knots or so, which led to low-speed side excursion. I'm not aware of any other high-speed side excursions during takeoff involving tiller use.
Okay. I happened to find two accidents, one involving an American Flight 102 that was a runway departure following landing in Dallas-Fort Worth in 93, and the other was Tower Air, Boeing 747 in 95 at JFK. And it was interesting because in the similarities on this, they both crew members in those situations lost directional control for different reasons. One was in crosswind conditions, which is interesting kind of now looking back at that Dallas information. They had measured crosswinds, and I'm not sure if we looked at the data now with what we can do now, maybe we would have found higher winds. But in the tower accident, it sounds like it almost could come from this report a little bit. The captain's recollection was that his initial attempt to control the leftward veer with the right rudder and nose wheel steering through the rudder pedals. He recalled using the tiller only after finding his rudder pedal inputs to be ineffective. And we also in that case found that the rudder pedal inputs would have been effective in maintaining directional control on the runway. The captain relaxed the crosswind control inputs and attempted to steer the airplane with the nose wheel steering tiller during the landing roll in DFW. So I wonder if maybe, there's something happening here. I mean, we definitely talked about a reversion, in a time of stress. We did make some recommendations in the Tower Air event to talk to folks about not getting on the tiller, and to make that guidance clear. We issued some information to POIs to check the handbooks, but in this case, one of the big lessons that seemed to come out of Tower Air was when you have a loss of directional control, you have to make a decision to reject very quickly. You need to get on it right away. And you commented in your presentation that the captain took over 5 seconds to reject the takeoff. I wonder if the staff thinks that this is causal, the failure to reject, not just the failure to input the correct rudder input and maintain directional control, but once you're losing that directional control, to reject the takeoff quickly.
Ideally, we'd like to see the rejected takeoff initiated a little bit earlier in a similar situation, but I don't think it's a sense of staff that the initiation of a rejected takeoff 2 seconds earlier would have had a significant effect on the outcome of the event in terms of damage and injuries.
Okay.
In this case.
And you cited a British AIRBOYD study that looked at response time for rejected takeoffs, and you cited the average response time was 2 to 4 seconds. and I believe that this captain's response time was 5.7?
5.75, yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. And we said he was kind of a little bit outside of the 2 to 4 seconds, but we should be clear that that study was actually looking at pilots who were in the simulator, who were prepared and potentially looking for, an emergency situation where they were going to have to be respond and they were going to be tested to respond.
This is true, and they noted that in their study that this is perhaps a slightly optimistic estimate of response time.
Okay, so do we think that if he had performed an immediate reject, he could have stopped the airplane on the runway or not
No.
gone so far off?
No.
It happened so quickly, there was no way for him to stop it once it turned.
Not to prevent the excursion once it was turning at the rate it was turning.
Okay.
About 3 to 4 seconds before the excursion, if he had reapplied right rudder, he may have been able to stop the excursion.
Okay. Member Sumwalt.
No questions, Madam Chairman.
Member Weiner.
No questions.
Member Roskine.
No questions.
Vice Chairman. Okay, back to me. Can we talk about how often we see events like this? Mr. English, I think when we met, we talked a little bit about the frequency of this and how unusual it was for the crew to see winds like this. And we looked at some data, and I think that we found that it was very unusual for them to see winds this high. What really is the range of winds that pilots can expect to see, when they're flying the line?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. As Dr. Bramble mentioned, when we initially started interviewing pilots after the event, we would ask how often. At that time, we didn't know the details, but used 30 knots as a good example, a starting point, and asked pilots how often they might encounter a 30-knot crosswind. And very many of them thought that it was quite common, but they were more thinking of 30-knot winds rather than the crosswind component. Once we were able to look more deeply into the data that Continental provided for us, that gave us a wider, broader look, we realized that it was actually quite rare to see the takeoff in crosswinds above 30 knots, at least amongst Continental's fleet. And we did find that it was roughly equivalent to the amount of times a crew might encounter an actual engine failure right at V1, which is also a very rare event.
So that question leads me to kind of the follow-up. Thank you very much. You responded exactly where I was trying to go. So if we're going to make some recommendations about how to better prepare crews to face situations like this, there might be a response from the industry that we don't see these conditions very often, and simulator time is very valuable. They've kind of got it's a box, and you're only going to fit so much into the box. Are we being reasonable and expecting them to train for situations like this because they in fact are so rare?
We think so. The rarity is part of the risk, in fact, because pilots don't get to practice up to that level of proficiency. As I mentioned, high-speed RTO. I think Dr. Weiner could certainly give us plenty of information on the high-speed RTO risks. I know we train for that, and yet those are very rare events, but they also have the high risk and the high possibility of a catastrophic outcome.
Okay, very good. I'd like to finish with some questions about the simulator modeling that was done on the 757 or 737-500. Mr. Birch, can you please talk to me about that a little bit? Was there simulator modeling done?
There was. The board does have data on older 737s, and we started out of the investigation asking for data on the 500, the differences between some of the older versions versus the 500, and we weren't getting everything we needed, and so we started down a path of modifying the older versions to make it a 500 the best we could. And I think in the end, we we have it right. I know that there was an independent assessment, and compared to what we were doing, and everything collapsed in the same area. So I feel comfortable with what we're presenting here today in terms of wind numbers, extractions, tiller inputs, and so forth.
Okay, so we were basically having to build on existing models that we had with some incremental information that we received from the manufacturer.
Correct.
In future investigations, would we be inclined to specifically request an accurate and up-to-date aerodynamic model from the manufacturer?
Yes, we would. They are the experts in this area, and as parties to the investigation, I think that we'd like to use their expertise.
And why is it important for us to be able to develop our own model?
Well, I wouldn't, we don't want to develop our own model.
Right, I'm saying have the good information so that we can use in our analysis and modeling.
Well, as I highlighted in the investigation, or my presentation this morning, the wind extraction on the ground required good aerodynamic models. It required a good gear model, and the results were only as good as those models. So it's only with the good high fidelity models that we're going to get accurate results.
And it's important for us to be able to do that ourselves independently and not have to rely on other people to provide that information to us.
Certainly. Boeing is expert on the airplane, and they know how it works, and I'd like to use them for that knowledge. But in terms of investigation, I think that's where the NTSB has expertise. So with the right wrappers on Boeing's models, I think we get the best result.
Very well, thank you. Any other questions from my colleagues? We will take a 10-minute break and come back at 11 o'clock. Welcome back, and we'll move to the next presentation. Mr. Ike.
Thank you. Chairman, if possible, before Mr. Ike begins his presentation, I wonder if Mr. DeLisi could just make a quick comment.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. Just wanted to clarify that it may not have come across properly. During the course of the investigation, we learned that Continental's simulator did not have the gust feature activated in the software. That was not a conscious decision made on the part of Continental to shut that off. They were as surprised as we were once we delved into the software that drives the simulator to realize that there were no gust effects happening. There actually is a switch in the Continental simulator that turns gusts on and off, and as they were going through training exercises, they were using that switch thinking that the software was going to generate wind gusts. Only in hindsight did we learn that nothing was actually happening.
And we didn't even understand that when we did our testing in the simulator runs. We thought we were getting gusts too.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. We're ready when you are.
Thank you. Good morning. I will discuss the weather conditions surrounding the time of the accident, the different weather detection systems, and weather dissemination issues. The upper air data and satellite imagery indicated that conditions were favorable for mountain wave activity on the day of the accident. A mountain wave basically refers to the wave-like flow of air that occurs downstream of the high terrain when the wind direction and speed are in phase and the atmosphere is sufficiently stable. These conditions are common during the winter months when strong pressure gradients and jet stream winds occur. Numerous pilot reports also confirm the existence of moderate to strong mountain wave activity during the period, with reports of moderate and greater turbulence and low-level wind shear. As a result of the conditions, the National Weather Service had a series of advisories current for moderate turbulence from the surface to 41,000 feet over Colorado, and the Denver observations reported gusty westerly winds over 20 knots intermittently throughout the day. The National Weather Service terminal forecast for Denver expected winds from the west at 16 knots, gusting to 24 knots through the time of the accident. This information was available to the pilot's pre-flight weather package. The National Center for Atmospheric Research, or NCAR, assisted the weather group and provided a high-resolution model of the conditions surrounding the period, as you see in this image. The image is a depiction of the west to east wind component over the mountains, which are depicted in the lower left, with the Denver airport indicated by the arrow. Wind speeds are shown by the color shading, and the model depicted a strong mountain wave signature over the area with strong winds in the foothills and an undulating wave pattern with several fingers of high velocity winds penetrating downward towards the surface around the time of the accident. This is a view of the model from above with the accident site marked with the encircled X. The wind vectors are in black and provide the wind direction and relative strength of the wind, with the wind speeds indicated by the color shading. Winds of 15 knots are in blue. Winds in the yellow, orange, red, and browns are winds over 40 knots. Areas in the pink are more of an easterly wind or wind reversal. This model depicts a band of strong winds over the northern portions of the airport, gradually coming over the center of the airport, with lighter winds over the south and southeast portion of the airport. Prior to the accident, right about now, you see a small area of high-speed winds breach the surface and move over the runway, which is what we believe was the winds of 45 knots that impacted the aircraft. Next slide is a still image at 1812, immediately prior to the accident. And basically the area enclosed with the red circle is the band of high winds which has reached the surface. And at this point right here, it's around 45 to 50 knots, which will rapidly move eastward across the airport. Again, the key point here is on the southeast section of the airport. Notice the light winds in blue. And again, these small-scale, high-speed winds reaching a surface, all tied to the mountain wave, and which are rapidly moving eastward. These wind gusts are being undetected by the predominant large-scale part of the network. Based on this model and some of the other findings in the investigation, Staff has proposed a recommendation on additional research into mountain waves to identify the hazards, improve detection, and the dissemination of wind information to controllers and pilots. The official source of weather information at airports comes from the National Weather Service Automated Surface Observation System, or ASOS, like the one depicted in the slide. It is an automated system that provides routine hourly weather observations with specials as necessary when significant changes in weather occur. The observations are disseminated through the FAA and the National Weather Service communication networks to users and to the tower, and is the basis for the ATIS report. On the top of the red and white pole in the picture, at a standard height of 10 meters or 33 feet, is the sonic anemometer, which uses ultrasonic sound waves to measure wind direction and speed every 1 second. The wind observation reported by the ASOS is a 2-minute average wind with gusts during the last 10 minutes prior to the observation. The system will also report a peak wind in the remarks section of the report if a wind gust exceeds 25 knots or more since the last observation. The Denver ASOS is located east of the main terminal and runways 35 left and 17 right, indicated by the large red circle on the image, with secondary instruments located north of the primary equipment by the smaller red circle. The accident site is marked by a red star on the image here and was located approximately 2.5 miles northwest of the ASOS sensors. The Denver ASOS reported the following conditions surrounding the period. About 90 minutes prior to the accident, the system reported winds 290 degrees true at 16 knots, gusting to 19 knots, with a peak wind of 28 knots. This observation was included in the flight's pre-flight weather package. At 1700, a peak wind of 27 knots was reported by the ASOS, but not disseminated. The next scheduled observation at 1753, the ASOS reported winds from 280 degrees at 11 knots with no gusts. This was disseminated in the ATIS report. The accident occurred at 1818, and at 1823, the ASOS recorded another peak wind gust at 36 knots, which was also not disseminated. A special observation was issued at 1834 as a result of the accident and indicated wind from 290 degrees at 24 knots, gusting to 32, with an earlier peak wind of 36 knots in the remarks. You will note that there's little directional variation in the wind during the period. However, there is a periodic or variation in the wind speeds and gust through the period. While the ASOS is the official source of weather, ATC uses the Low-Level Wind Shear Alert System, or LWAS, for real-time wind information. The Denver LWAS consists of 32 wind sensors located strategically around the airport, approximately 1.5 miles apart. The LWAS system is designed to detect the existence of horizontal wind shear conditions typically associated with thunderstorms, and alerts controllers when these conditions are hazardous. Several alerts were triggered by the LWAS for the east-west runways during the period due to performance or wind speed changes. However, none were detected with the north-south runways. The LWAS system is also utilized to provide ATC the airport wind, which at Denver comes from sensor number 2, located near the center of the airport. Other sensors are used to provide specific approach and departure wind information using the nearest designated sensors. The ASOS system also happens to be co-located with sensor number 14 of the LWAS system. Both reported similar winds on the night of the accident. Air traffic control's primary access to the LWAS information is through the Ribbon Display Terminal, or RBDT, where controllers can read out the data without interpolation. Similar to the ASOS wind, the airport wind from sensor 2 provides a 2-minute average wind with a gust factor. The airport wind was not issued to the flight and was reported from 280 degrees at 35 knots, gusting to 40 knots. Specific threshold or runway winds utilize individual sensors closest to the respective flight paths. These sensors report a 6-second wind value with no wind gust or crosswind component. The advantage of the LWAS wind data is that it is updated every 10 seconds. At the time of the takeoff clearance, runway 34 right, the departure winds from sensor 3 were reported from 270 at 27 knots and were provided to the flight. Dan Bartlett will discuss the air traffic controller's use of the system in more detail immediately following my presentation, but I would like to illustrate the sampling rate of the LWAS system in more detail first. The LWAS sensors use a 6-second sampling rate, which staff believes does not adequately account for wind gusts. As illustrated here, under unusual conditions such as thunderstorms, mountain wave conditions, significant variations in winds can occur in each of the 1-second reading, and accounts for possible reason why some of the higher bands of winds were not detected by the LWAS. The 1-second wind observations, when averaged over the 6-second period in this example, would be reported at 37 knots, which was similar to what one of the sensors did report. This is a display of the LWAS wind vectors at the time of the accident. The LWAS wind vectors showed a band of strong westerly winds over the center of the airport, with lighter winds north and south over the arrival runways and in the vicinity of the ASOS system, which staff believes was a result of the mountain wave and was consistent with the NCAR model. Staff believes improvements in the LWAS algorithms can be made to provide multiple sensor data in the ribbon display system to provide wind gust, crosswind, or tailwind component, and has proposed a safety recommendation in this area. That concludes my presentation. I'll stand by for your questions. Where do you want to go with Dan next?
Mr. Reich, thank you very much for your presentation. That was very helpful. I think that the board members agree that it would be better to go ahead and let Mr. Bartlett do his presentation, and then we can question all together. Thanks.
Good morning. I'll discuss air traffic control wind dissemination and runway selection issues related to this accident. As Mr. Ike just stated, Denver Airport has 32 low-level wind shear advisory system, or LWAS, sensors located around the airport, depicted in this diagram by pink circles. Each runway end has 3 sensors that provide for a 180-degree arc around the end of the runway. This arc is for runways 34 right and 34 left. One of the 3 sensors associated with a particular runway end provide wind and wind shear information to tower and approach controllers for the approach or the departure end of the runway in use. These are referred to as departure end wind for departures and threshold wind for arrivals. Of the 3 sensors, 1 sensor is primary and the other 2 sensors are backup. On the evening of December 20th, Sensor 3 was the primary sensor being used for runway 34 right departures, with sensors numbers 9 and 4 as backup. Sensor 2, highlighted in red, located approximately 8,000 feet south of Sensor 3, provides controllers with the airport wind. Controllers receive the wind information on the ribbon display terminal, or RBDT, which is shown here. This presentation duplicates what the controller would have seen on the RBDT at the time takeoff clearance was issued to Continental 1404. The top line shows the airport wind, which is a 2-minute average of the wind direction and speed at sensor number 2, and gust information based on information received from all 32 sensors on the airport. 34RD is the wind direction and speed at the departure end of runway 34 right, which was sensor number 3 on the night of the accident. At the time of the accident, airport wind indicated 280 at 35 knots, gusting to 40. The tower controller issued the crew of Continental 1404 270 at 27, which was wind direction and speed provided by sensor number 3, displayed on the RBDT as 34RD. According to interviews with Denver Tower Management, it is common practice to issue threshold winds to arriving aircraft and departure end winds to departing aircraft. However, Denver Standard Operating Procedure, or SOP, directs controllers to issue LWAS center field wind, i.e. airport wind, to departures. Staff believes that the FAA has not reconciled the discrepancy between the common practice of issuing departure and threshold wind and the published procedure of issuing airport wind to departing aircraft. Staff has proposed a safety recommendation in this area. The Air Traffic Control Order states in part that the runway to be utilized for arrival and departures is the runway most nearly aligned with the wind when the wind is 5 knots or more, unless the use of another runway or runways will be operationally advantageous or is requested by the pilot. The operational advantage clause of this directive does not require consideration of additional factors such as excessive crosswinds, and staff has proposed a recommendation in this area. When deciding which runways to use, the Denver Tower and radar supervisors work together to select the appropriate runway configuration. In making their decision, they consider prevailing and forecast wind, runway availability, airport activity, traffic flow, snow removal efforts, density altitude, and the greatest arrival and departure rate. Denver Air Traffic Control Management's runway selection policy does not clearly account for crosswind components when selecting a runway configuration. It is an unofficial and unpublished policy. Runway utilization that provided for the highest airport arrival rate, which can average 120 aircraft per hour, is the primary factor affecting runway selection at Denver, unless wind shear reports or pilot requests forces ATC to reconsider current runway configuration. On the day of the accident, there were no pilot complaints or pilot-initiated go-arounds at Denver in the 2 hours preceding this accident. Data suggests that operational advantage is the primary criteria for runway selection at Denver and will not be modified unless a pilot request or complaints dictate that another configuration be considered. This practice does not take prevailing or forecast wind into consideration. Staff has proposed a recommendation in this area as well. That concludes my presentation. Don and I would be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Member Sumwalt.
Mr. Wright, thank you for your clear presentation. I think the in-car simulation there was very graphic and very helpful. Thank you. It shows how the wind really was very isolated, the strongest part going right across the center part of that runway. I assume these wind shear, these LWAS sensors, the anemometers, are very strategically located. They're not just thrown out there at random. And you said this, that an LWAS system, and I remember when the system was developed years ago, it was after some wind shear related accidents, but the type of wind shear we're talking about there was the convective activity, microburst activity. So what I want to know is these LWAS sensors, are they more designed to detect like microburst activity as opposed to crosswind sort of crosswind activity?
There is no planning at all of the LWAS system for crosswinds at all. They were initially developed after major wind shear thunderstorm accidents, and their primary algorithms, the software that runs the system, are to alert for wind speed performance changes that would affect the aircraft and microburst detection.
So that would probably explain why for the departure winds, they're using LWAS sensor 3, which is located towards the departure end of that runway, as opposed to using the LWAS sensor 2, which is closest to the runway 34 right threshold. And as we pointed out in our draft report, the winds, the crosswinds that would affect a pilot the most during the takeoff run would be those winds on the runway, whereas a wind shear, and it depends how we define wind shear, but a microburst sort of an activity would be most hazardous after rotation, so that's why they're probably using the LWAS sensor number 3. Do you concur with that?
I agree, but it should be noted, though, with regards to the warning system of the LWAS, all the sensors are active. So the data is coming from all the sensors, but the controllers are providing the specific sensors, as Dan and I mentioned. So the system itself will alert them for shears, performance shears specifically in this case, but it's what sensor they're going to use for relaying wind. But you are correct that you would want the most runway-specific winds, which would be one or multiple sensors.
Now, to be clear, this aircraft, Continental 1404, did not encounter a performance-enhancing or performance-decreasing wind in the pure sense. It encountered a crosswind. Do you agree?
That is correct.
Now, who decides which sensors will be used? Back on the ribbon display band, the controller doesn't select that he or she wants to use number 3 or number 7. Is that correct? That's pre-programmed in, that if they're using these runways for departure?
That's correct.
Okay. Is it true that if you're looking at like the runway 34 right departure winds, that ribbon display will not, that specific ribbon display for that runway will not display gust? Is that correct?
That's correct.
Only the airport wind?
Yes. It will display shear wind.
Shear wind.
In fact, it will display that there is a shear wind associated with that runway.
If there's a wind shear?
Yes, sir.
And it will come up and say it will give a specific anticipated airspeed loss?
Yes.
Okay. So here's what I want to know. Based on the forecast that was in effect at the time of the departure, the winds were forecast to be 300 degrees at 16, gust to 24. That sounds reasonable for Denver ATC to be using the northerly departures. It's more closely aligned. The crosswind would be more closely aligned. It would only be 40 or 50 degrees off of the runway heading for departing off of runway 34, 35, but it would be, if you're using 25, it would be a 50-degree crosswind. So it does seem reasonable that ATC was using those runways for takeoff and landing. What are your feelings about that, Mr. Bartlett?
Well, you have prevailing and you have forecast. And you look at what you have and you can determine trends. And the people that are making the decision on which runways to utilize have data from all sensors as well as from the airport wind. Evidence indicates that 270 was more predominant than 300. So forecast and prevailing were in somewhat of a contradiction.
I agree. Yes, they were in contradiction there. But at the time of the takeoff, according to what the controller was reporting, the winds were 270 at 27, which is a 26.2 knot crosswind, which was just about where the Denver ATC guidelines were. They said, generally speaking, suspend using that runway when requested by a pilot or when the crosswind exceeds 25. So
generally speaking, that was
generally speaking.
Yes.
Were those written down, those guidelines?
No, sir.
They were not even written down?
They are not written down.
Okay. I have more questions, but my time's up. Thank you.
Member Weiner.
I have no question at this time.
Member Rosekind.
I'm just curious, there was a lot of extra information available about the winds. Are there circumstances where that would have been provided?
From an air traffic control perspective, there's no requirement at this time. For example, the airport wind of 280 at 35 gust to 40, while the data was available, there was no requirement for that information to be disseminated. Staff's made a recommendation in that regard, but there was a lot of data available.
So, and just to clarify, so I understand there's the requirement, and are there other circumstances, though, where somebody would, on their own, with data and other circumstances, say I should have other information I should provide in this circumstance when I see this on my ribbon display or some other?
Other than the initiative, the individual initiative of the controller, no.
Thank you.
Vice Chairman.
I'm sorry, I neglected to write down the number of this slide, but there was a slide that showed the screen that has the airport winds at the top and then the winds for each runway. Could you bring that? Slide 5. Yeah, okay, great. Thank you. Now, okay, walk me through this now. The only one of these that would have any gust information is the top line? That's correct. The others were not designed to have gusts, because what they were designed for is that if they disagree with each other, then that generates a wind shear alert.
Yes.
Irrespective, without any regard to gusts.
Without regard to gusts, they are designed, and the LWAS is designed to indicate, to sense and report wind shear.
Okay, so walk me through what the typical practice is for what the controller gives the pilot, and then what the required practice is. Help me with that.
I have an aircraft departing. The pilot. I'm sorry.
In terms of what they tell the pilot.
They tell the pilot what they see with regard to the action associated to the runway. If an aircraft was landing on runway 7, the aircraft would be issued wind at 270 at 23. Departing 34 left, the wind issued would have been 270 at 25.
Is there any requirement to include the airport, the AW, the airport wind in that report to the pilot?
Negative.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have.
What do they use if they are not reporting the airport wind on the top line there to the pilot? What do they use that for? What is the purpose of having that on their display?
As I don't know, as near as I can tell, it will be in response to a pilot request for additional information.
Okay. And some of this is maybe going to call on Dr. Bramble, because it's kind of integrating some of the information we're hearing here and what decisions the pilot makes. So did you get a sense when you interviewed the controllers that they understood where the wind was coming from? There's some assumptions based in the programming that's underlying the presentation that's given to them. We've got 32 sensors all over the airport. We're using select sensors in certain situations. Do the controllers understand the information that's kind of being used to present the information to them?
Not in the detail that would allow them to
discriminate.
Make some association, some discrimination. Yeah. The biggest awareness that I got from the controller interviews was that at about 30 knots they needed to start paying attention to other factors. But until then, it was pretty much we're going to go with what we're going until somebody complains.
Okay. When you said at about 30 knots, are you saying on the winds that they would give on the second line, not the first line?
Correct. The winds issued in a crosswind situation.
And so we have kind of a general sense from the community, from conversations we've had and from the information that you gleaned, that after things start getting past 30 knots, people start getting a little bit uncomfortable. We may have people declining. It may be a guideline or a limitation issue, but that's kind of the point where we start to have some discomfort and people declining.
Yes, that's what I have found.
Okay, so but in this situation we have the airport winds at 280, clearly over 30. It's 35, gusting to 40. Is there not any kind of trigger that maybe we want to share this information with the pilots?
We discovered a discrepancy with operating practice versus published requirements, and that aircraft departing Denver are to be issued the airport wind. In this case, the Continental 1404 would have been issued 280 at 35 gusting to 40, and quite possibly affected the pilot's decision whether or not to depart. We solicited information from the FAA to help us understand the discrepancy between the two practices, and the response from our query was rather confusing and insufficient. So there's a discrepancy in procedure, and if airport wind had been issued, things might have been different. We've also made a recommendation that in the event of certain triggers, if you will, as you identified, that airport wind or additional information would be provided to the pilot in addition to the information that's already provided. For example, 270 at 27, airport wind, 280 35 gust 40.
Just one little bit.
Absolutely.
It's buried in our docket information, but just I think to one of the things that you're getting at as well, Madam Chairman, as far as the awareness and the trigger, looking back at the history of the airport wind, the 30 knot value and any gust value reported on that airport wind line would have only been there for less than 3 minutes prior to Continental 1404's departure clearance. So the trend of that greater than 30 knots in gust factor on the airport wind line hadn't been there for very long either. There was an increasing trend, but those types of triggers that you're interested in, more than 30 and gusts, were relatively new.
Okay. Yeah. And, when we look at the circumstances that the that the crew was faced with. The initial winds that they were given were 11 knots from the ATIS. Then they get an update as they're getting their clearance, 27. They don't get the information about 35 gusting to 40. Here's a captain, very experienced, a lot of time, total time, hundreds of air carrier landings in the Navy, a lot of time in the 737. He sees a 1900 takeoff right before him, no problem. I did want to note, because we did talk about training earlier, that Continental, that he did take training in the 2004-2005 era with Continental, where he did takeoffs and landings with a 35-knot steady wind, correct?
That's correct, yes.
So, we have potentially some training, some experience, some other cues that he's getting and information he's not getting. Dr. Bramble, do you think if he had been given airport winds 280, 35 knots gusting to 40, that he wouldn't have taken off?
I think it's highly unlikely.
So really, kind of this accident started back at the threshold, because if he had had that information, he wouldn't have gone. I mean, there's a go, no-go decision that precipitates every actual event, an accident, and he made a go decision based on information that he had, but that wasn't the best information that was available. If he had had the best information, would we potentially not have even gone to this accident? If he had sat maybe and waited a little bit?
That's quite possible.
I want to ask I will defer to my colleagues. Member Sumwell.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I had a similar question that you had, and that is, do the controllers know where the ASOS, where the sensors are coming from? And I just wonder if in their mind and their training, they're taught that, hey, the PhDs up there in Boulder, Colorado have come up and designed this system, and those sensors are strategically located to give the best operational information. They likely don't know that for 3-4 right departure, that sensor is in X location. Is that probably true?
I think they have a clear understanding that the wind that's showing on the RBDT is from the geographical area of the airport, i.e. for departures will be at departure end, for arrivals will be at the threshold. However, of the three, they don't know which of the three sensors are providing data.
Right. Now, let's say that a controller did try to be really, really smart and stick his neck out and say, hey, I understand this, and sensor 3 is up there way at the departure end of the runway to the east of the departure end, but sensor 2, which is really airport winds, is closer to the threshold of that runway. And so I'm a pilot. I fly light airplanes, you might think, so I want to give this pilot the best winds for his or her takeoff roll, so he or she, the controller, decides, well, I'm going to go up there and give airport winds or something. Is that controller really going to be sticking his neck out, sticking her neck out, sort of going against established procedures? In the airline business, we didn't encourage that sort of innovative thinking. We wanted people to follow the procedures. And if the procedure was wrong, we wanted to know about it so we could change the procedure. So how about if a controller tried to be really smart and provide something outside of those SOPs?
As an enabler, an air traffic controller is going to give the pilot, has the potential to give the pilot as much information as possible. In this particular situation, the local controller could have, without any possible, get any kind of trouble, issued both winds.
And I'm going to ask this again. Would the controllers at Denver have understood that the AW, or the airport winds, that sensor was located at a certain location, which happens to be closest to the runway 34 departure, runway 34 threshold? Do the controllers know that specific information?
I can't speak to what the controllers know with regard to that. However, historically, an airport wind sensor has been at the center of an airport.
Well, but the center of the airport is down there by number 14, which is where the ASOS is. Is that correct?
Well, with a 52-mile airport, the center is kind of a big target, so I would say that sensor number 2 is relatively close to the center of the airport.
Okay, then why did they locate the ASOS sensor way down where it is?
I don't know.
Okay. Mr. DeLisi, I had my assistant call you yesterday late afternoon. I want to see if this is an editorial change, an editorial issue. I call your attention to page 35. And page 35 on line 4, lines 3 and 4, we say facility managers may designate the use of displayed wind information oriented to the threshold end of the runway in lieu of airport winds. But then on line 8, we say additionally the existence of a letter to airmen allows ATC facility managers to authorize air traffic controllers to issue. Threshold was struck, and runway departure end was inserted. And I think that was in response to a generic letter that I wrote that I thought we were using those terms incorrectly. But did staff inadvertently strike threshold? Should that word threshold still be there, since it specifically references that back in line 4?
Yes, it should. Thank you for the heads up. We might have gotten a little threshold happy and struck it in an inappropriate place.
Well, I do appreciate staff making those changes because to me, I think we've clarified it. But in this particular case, I think we undid something. So would it be reasonable for the board to assume that staff will make that as an editorial change?
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. I have more questions, but I'll defer to my colleagues. Thank you.
Member Weiner.
No questions.
Member Roskine.
No questions.
Vice Chairman.
I was left a little bit confused about whether the controllers were supposed to report the airport wind or not, because I thought I heard one answer that said no, but then another one that talked about the policy that said they should report it. Would you help me with that?
Contradiction in policy versus public procedure is that the departure end and the threshold winds are issued. That's policy. Published procedure in the Denver Air Traffic Standard Operating Procedure requires air traffic controllers to issue the departure end wind to departures. We have a discrepancy in practice versus procedure at Denver.
Okay, so the published procedure would require that the airport wind be reported.
Yes, sir.
I understand. Okay. Now walk me through what information the pilot would have had. It strikes me that a lot of the problem here is surprise to the pilot. I mean, regarding the existence of gusts. He knew about the crosswind, but did he know about the gust? Walk me through what information he would have had that would have told him there were gusty conditions at the time. The first starting with the ATIS and then moving through the information that he had.
The only way that he would have had gust information, number one, it was on the ATIS. This particular ATIS at 1753, 280 at 11 knots did not include gust information. So there was nothing there. When he was issued a departure clearance, the wind 270 at 27, there was no gust information, and there is no gust information available via the LWAS sensors. For him to have been able to be aware of a gust influence, he would have had to had issued to him the airport wind.
I see. Other than just feeling it while he's taxiing out. If it's that gusty, he could probably feel it while he's taxiing out, but he has no clue how the magnitude of it. He could feel there's something gusty, probably even in an airplane that size, right?
Yes.
Okay.
There was other discussions going on at the time. There was a Frontier 811 on 3-4 left that was asking about gusts.
Okay.
Actually, he asked for shear, and the tower reported that we have shear wind, but it's on runway 25.
Okay, and then the pilot would have also gotten some information from his own dispatcher. That would be pretty old by now, I suppose, but was there gust information on there?
I don't know, Don.
On his weather document, he did have some of the observations which showed the wind gusts earlier. Forecast had gusts, but one of the key things is the rhythmic nature of this mountain wave. And if you notice, there was a period of gusts, then it would go lull, gust, lull. And when the time the ATIS was made, it was just in a lull. Winds started picking up. They're taxiing out. Captain even comments about the clouds. Look how rapidly they're moving across the skies. And then it's given the winds at 27 knots. Hey, that's a direct crosswind. They're aware of it. There were advisories for mountain wave activity in his weather document. Winds at the surface and mountain waves can be very variable. They can be light winds at the surface and 50 knots immediately above the surface. Aircraft, in this case, we're reporting 45 to 50 knots, 700 feet above the surface. So they were there. It's just a matter of what's being reported at the surface and that random gust.
So there is a good likelihood that this gust of this magnitude caught him by surprise.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. English, you mentioned that they only had information on their ribbon displays about 3 minutes prior that they had 35 gusting to 40. What was it before then?
Let's say I've gone back a few minutes, and as Don mentioned, it was quite variable. I went back as far as 12 minutes, and it was 28 or 280 at 28 with no gust. And then as we historically go back, there's an increase again. As Don mentioned, you'd see over the course of maybe 30-minute periods a rising and a falling in the wind velocity. An interesting point to note, again, in the differences between airport wind and a specific wind, departure and wind. Another aircraft, I believe it was an Airbus, another operator, departed and was issued a wind of 31 knots, yet at that time the airport wind was a little bit lower. So there was quite a bit of variability in the wind field, as we've noted. It's also important to note when we start to talk about our conclusions and our reasoning here, I hope I'm not getting ahead of the game, the value that was depicted on airport wind came from sensor 2. It's got some processing to it and averaging. That's not the same small phenomena that impacted the airplane. The numbers that you would read, the values are very similar, but it's not the same. If you remember from Don's presentation, that small blob of wind that impacted the runway is not the same. And we also note that at the beginning of the aircraft, the accident aircraft's takeoff roll, in the wind extraction, the wind is actually quite close to 27 knots. So this is, and I think Don intimated this, a surprise, a small microscale phenomena that, in spite of what's perceived to be probably one of the best wind sensing systems in the country, things still can sneak through, and something snuck through.
And, you know, we're predicating some information in that they kind of had worst case scenario information available that they didn't share with the pilots, and I think that's kind of the challenge here. But it could very well have been that they could have been given a takeoff clearance minutes before or minutes after, and it would not have exceeded Continental's 33-knot guideline, and so the pilot would not have necessarily elected not to go at that point in time. So the concern is there's a lot of variability, but there's a lot of information. And I think universally when I talk to the controllers, and I also talked to some pilots who flew in and out of Denver, both of them said, when I asked which wind information would you want to provide or would you want to receive, they all said, we want to receive the information that's most appropriate to our flight. You know, the controller said we want to give the pilots the best information when they take off, and the pilots thought they were going to be receiving the best information that was most appropriate to them. And I think what we've seen in this accident is that something did slip through, and you know, circumstances in any event, any accident scenario could be different, give or take a few seconds, you know, a little bit more rudder, a little less wind, things could be different. But what we're seeing is learn some lessons here and change the procedures. You have a very sophisticated sensing system. You need to make sure that you're using that data as effectively as possible. And so I think our recommendations are saying get some data, develop some models and some empirical assessment of that, train the pilots, and disseminate the information. We want everyone to have kind of better tools if they're faced with this again. I think one of the questions that we had was, how much responsibility does the air traffic control system have to advance what they're seeing, the forecast? They know what's coming. And it seems to me that in our report we talk about their guidance for runway selection is primarily focused on efficiency, on operational efficiency, and they're almost waiting for the pilot to be the guinea pig to wave it off and say, I can't take this, I can't do it, I'm going to go around. And they don't turn the airport until they get, that they're waiting for this leading indicator, and actually, unfortunately, it's a trailing indicator at that point. At that point, things have already gone bad. They're already to a point where people can't take it anymore. And so the question that I have is how realistic is it to expect an airport like Denver in the location that they are with all of their arrivals and everything else that kind of flows out from that to actually turn the airport before they absolutely have to? What if the winds don't come through as forecast and they go through all these machinations to change the airport around?
That's their job. You base your decision on information that you have. If you roll a runway or you roll the airport, only have to roll it back. You rolled it based on data and guidelines that have been established based on experience. The chasing the situation or the reactive decision making, and we're not talking just about Denver, we're talking about the whole NAS and the whole idea of 7110. In Denver's case, it is a complicated airport, and this would be a complicated procedure and would require an awful lot of effort. So at least staff recommends that at least these things are considered and not reacted to.
If I can add a bit to that as well. Dan makes an excellent point there. There is an impact on the entire NAS. It's also not a black or white situation. It's not a stop or go on a runways. There's lots of things that the air traffic system can do in between, so that a change in runways does not basically wipe out the western half of the United States. Spacing out the arrivals a little bit gives you some time to react when a situation is developing so that it doesn't immediately break down. So there's a lot of things that can be built into a plan like that to anticipate that reaction by the crew. And the crew really is, they may not be the leading indicator, but at least the best trailing indicator. All the weather information is historical as well. It's always what did happen. And we all know that weather forecasts are sometimes good and sometimes not.
Yeah. I think that what we see in this accident is what we see in so many accidents where everything is getting sliced just a little bit, just a little closer, just a little tighter, and the buck gets passed to someone else. And then at the point where you get to the very end, it's that person who's rolling down the runway who's the last one who's kind of holding the bag. There are a lot of places where a different information, more conservative estimates, changes, more information could have been provided. But you get to that last point, and it's just a question of how strong that gust is, and do they respond rapidly and quickly as they're expected to do, but maybe they haven't been trained for. Very challenging. Remember someone?
Yes, when I was flying the line, sometimes ATC would assign me a departure runway, and I may need another runway, maybe a longer runway because we were too heavy, or we needed a runway more aligned with the wind. And ATC, we would request the other runway. They would say, do you have an operational necessity for that runway? And we'd say yes, and they would assign it to us. In the 7110 manual, ATC refers to assigning a different runway if it would be operationally advantaged. But I'm afraid in this case, they're not referring to operationally advantage to the people flying the aircraft. They're referring to operationally advantageous for the airport, for the throughput. Is that correct?
That's staff's interpretation, yes.
Thank you.
Dr. Meyer, are staff comfortable to proceed? We can finish with the last presentation and complete.
Yes, the staff has one brief presentation. Perhaps we could squeeze that in and then take a break.
Okay. We'll take the last presentation, and then we'll do a short break, and we'll come back and vote on the report. We won't be taking a lunch break until we're done. Okay.
Good morning. Is this on?
Good morning, Mr. George.
My presentation will address the emergency response for the accident, improved flight deck seats, cabin crew member jump seats, and aft galley restraints. This map shows the location of the 4 aircraft rescue and firefighting stations on the airfield in relation to the accident location. Following the accident, air traffic control personnel used the crash phone to alert the ARF stations of the accident. The controller who made the call initially gave the incorrect accident location to the ARF crews and was not able to correct the information prior to the trucks departing their stations. However, controllers were able to contact airport operations personnel on the airfield, who then relayed the correct location of the accident to the responding firefighters. 3 of the 4 responding crews received the revised location while en route and were not delayed getting to the accident site. However, the crew from ARF Station 4 responded toward the original incorrect location before receiving the revised location, and subsequently did not arrive at the accident site as soon as they might have. Overall, the response was sufficiently timely, and the ARF crews were effective in suppressing the exterior and interior fires. In 1988, FAA changed the crashworthiness requirements for seats on commercial airplanes to include dynamic testing and occupant protection criteria. Seats certified under the more stringent criteria were dubbed 16G seats. The new requirements only applied to newly type certificated airplanes, not to the existing fleet. The FAA also proposed rulemaking to require retrofit of the existing fleet with similar crashworthy seats. However, industry pushback delayed implementation until 2005. The final retrofit rule required newly manufactured airplanes to be fitted with 16G passenger and flight attendant seats, but did not require upgraded seats for the flight decks. In this accident, the flight deck occupants sustained back injuries and 1 received severe spinal fractures. The additional occupant protection provided by more crashworthy seats should be provided to all occupants, including flight deck crew members, and staff has proposed a recommendation in this area. The forward flight attendant seat pan broke during the accident. Fortunately, the crew member seated on the jump seat was not seriously injured. A materials laboratory examination of the jump seat indicated that the break had occurred in an area where metal fatigue cracks had weakened the structure. Although jump seats are routinely inspected for structural problems and functionality, similar fatigue cracks cannot be identified by visual inspections alone and require additional tests for detection. The structural integrity of cabin crew member seats is necessary for the safety of the crew and also to ensure that the crew member is available to conduct other safety procedures, such as emergency evacuation of passengers. Staff has proposed a recommendation in this area. During the accident, a quarter-turn latch bracket securing a drink carrier in the aft galley broke off, and the carrier fell into the vestibule adjacent to the aft exits. This photo shows the separated latch bracket placed on the galley work surface above its original mounting location. Note the brown glue residue where the bracket had been mounted. The latch bracket had been attached by adhesive only with no mechanical fasteners. The carrier is directly across from an aft-facing flight attendant jump seat, which was unoccupied at the time, but could be a serious safety hazard to anyone seated there. Following the accident, the galley manufacturer issued a service bulletin to install mechanical fasteners to contain the carrier. However, the service bulletin only applies to Continental Airlines. Neither Boeing nor the galley manufacturer was able to identify the number of similar installations in the fleet. The adhesives used to affix galley restraints are susceptible to degradation over time and may fail to contain items of mass, which could be hazardous to occupants or crew nearby. Staff has proposed a recommendation in this area. That concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Mr. George. Member Sumwalt.
Thank you. I do want to comment on the successful evacuation, the good work of the cabin crew. We had 3 flight attendants and 2 deadheading pilots in the back, and according to the draft report, they were instrumental in, they did block the right-hand side exits, which was the right move because the right-hand side of the aircraft was on fire, and furthermore, they kept the evacuation orderly, so it's good to see people reacting in accordance with their training and help get people safely off of a burning airplane. I want to talk just for a moment about the lack of the 16G seats in the cockpit, and that's something that I take personally. I've spent a lot of time sitting in those seats. We here at this board talk about one level of safety, and we usually refer to it as that we want passengers that get on an airplane to have the same level of safety as on one airplane versus the other. But here is a situation where the people seated in the back have ostensibly a higher level of safety. They have the 16G seats, whereas those in the cockpit don't have those seats. Is that correct, Mr. George?
That's how it will be over time. The retrofit rule is applying to newly manufactured airplanes. So over time, that is correct.
But it does not apply to the cockpit seats.
Right.
So do we have recommendations to correct that disparity?
We do.
All right, thank you. I finally want to talk about the ARF response. You indicated that there was some initial confusion about the location of the accident, and I can certainly understand that. It's dark. It would be hard for somebody to pinpoint the location of that. But as a result of that, there was some of the ARF vehicles that were heading up towards the original accident location saw a small jet in the location of the intersection around the Fox and the Whiskey Bravo intersection. I guess they spent less than a minute there, and then they proceeded towards the real accident location. But what was sort of almost comical was that the accident happened and the wreckage ended up behind the ARF station number 4. These ARF vehicles, the garage doors were faced away from the wreckage, so they came out, they turned to the west, and then proceeded southbound from there. The wreck is behind them, and these guys are headed down towards the wrong location. I think maybe once they heard the new location, they still saw the ARF vehicles down in the wrong location to the south, so they continued even further southbound. Is that generally true?
Yes, that's true. When they came back down Whiskey Charlie, back toward the runway, the accident was just off their left, but it's not visible from the difference in elevation keeps them from being able to see it from there. But they did see a lot of lights and activity just south, and so they turned that direction.
Certainly the outcome in this situation was good. The ARF response was less than 5 minutes, and as it turns out, the passengers had already evacuated, and so the fact that the ARF response was 5 minutes versus 2 or 3 minutes or 4 minutes, that was okay in this situation. But what I want to look at is not necessarily the outcome, but the process. And I asked staff, are we satisfied that there's some initial ambiguity concerning the location of the accident? And so I'm going to go back and say, well, I won't even give you the chance to answer that, because I'm going to say that the Safety Board has long been concerned about making sure that ARF vehicles can reach the accident sites in the most expeditious fashion. We can go back to a 1990 runway collision at Detroit, a DC-9, a 1994 crash in Charlotte, 1997 accident in Guam, 1998 727 at O'Hare, 98 Lear at Houston, in 1999 MD-80 at Little Rock, and finally 2007 in Traverse City. Now, some of these, like Little Rock, as I understand it, the ARF vehicles didn't reach the accident site until 16 minutes after the wreck, after the accident. So we're not talking about that in this situation. But as a result of the Little Rock accident, we did issue a recommendation to the FAA to evaluate crash detection technology and location technologies and select the most promising candidates for ensuring that the emergency responders could expeditiously arrive at the scene and implement, and then for the FAA to implement this equipment once it was found. We reiterated that in the Traverse City accident. Currently, that recommendation is open, unacceptable response. So what I'm really saying is, yes, we are fortunate that the outcome here was good, but, and I'm not saying I could do any better if I was an ARF responder, but we shouldn't be satisfied with an activity where people go to the wrong location. What about that recommendation that we issued in 2001, A01-66? where we're asking the FAA to come up with better crash detection technology. For example, ELTs, things like that. Mr. Marcus?
The FAA's initial response on that, their 90-day response, excuse me, was that they required forward-looking infrared radar cameras, infrared cameras in new trucks that were bought with their funds. We responded that that was not acceptable because being able to have the FLIR, the forward-looking infrared cameras, might allow better ability to locate it, but it didn't, or to see in the dark, but it didn't allow for the automatic crash location. They've never responded any further. They have not responded any further after we reiterated the recommendation, the Traverse City recommendation, and we've made some informal response, but we've never gotten any further information. I believe that they believe that the FLIR was sufficient, and they haven't done anything further since then.
But yet we have made the point that in all of those accidents, with the exception of one of them, the FLIR technology would not have helped. So we're looking for more than FLIR technology, correct?
That's correct, and we've communicated that point to them.
Okay. Well, I'm out of time, but is staff satisfied with the processes for this particular situation? That's what I'm asking. I mean, the outcome was okay, but are we satisfied that people headed off in the wrong direction away from the accident?
I'm not satisfied with that, but I understand the reason why, which was the controller gave them incorrect information to begin with, which was later corrected. But that was the genesis for going in the wrong direction.
Our job is not just to understand it, but whether is to look for things that could happen better. Here it didn't matter, but we shouldn't be satisfied the fact that the system allowed people to go to the wrong location. We've come out with recommendations in this area before, so I want staff to think about this. Should we be doing more in this area? I'm going to close right now, and maybe staff will come up with some thoughts during the break.
Member Weiner.
I'd like to follow up on Member Sumwalt's observation that one level of safety should apply to everybody in the airplane. All of the seats in the airplane except the flight deck, from what I read here, were 16G seats. Is that correct?
The only 16G seats in this aircraft were in first class, and they were 16G compatible.
The only 16G seats were in first class. Okay.
Correct.
The flight deck seats, though, have received an exemption, even from in the current ruling. Is that correct?
Exemption from being required to be 16G?
From being 16G seats.
Correct.
What's your understanding of the reason for the exemption?
What I've heard was that the argument was made, and I couldn't back this up with a reference, that the structure of the cockpit area is not such that it has the same, or it's more structural, let's say, than other parts of the cabin, and the floor doesn't deform nearly as likely, and therefore the need for stronger seats in there is not there. That's all I know of.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Member Roseman, Vice Chairman.
I had the same question as Member Weiner. What conceivable reason would there be to not have the seats of the people who have, by the way, the 5-point belt, which means that they're going to be protected from, the impact of movement and stuff? What conceivable reason would there be not to have those seats? Those are also the people going to help with the escape, in theory. So what conceivable reason would there be not to have those seats enhanced, if not as well as passenger seats, would be even better than the passenger seats? And I guess what you're saying is the cockpit structure, but that just strikes me as quite odd for people who have 5-point belts in their seats.
The seats in the cockpit tend to be more structural, by and large, than the passenger seats anyway. They're chunkier and better built, heavier. The thing that really enhances the pilot's safety with a 16G seat, or the passenger for that matter, is the fact that there's limits to occupant injury that's inherent in those seats that's not inherent. That is, let's look at it this way. If you could make a seat so structural that it didn't break on impact, but it imparts a lot of stress to the person sitting in it. Part of the requirements of the 16G seats, the upgraded seats, is to limit the amount of damage that is imposed to the occupant. That's where a lot of the benefit comes from the newer seats.
Okay, we'll just have to leave that one, because that just confounds me. The other question I had was, why did the service bulletin only apply to Continental? That was a little bit confusing, too.
I don't know how all that works, but this one, in this particular case, only applied to Continental.
But do we know if other carriers had similar situations of using the adhesive as opposed to mechanical connections, et cetera?
I wasn't able to find out very much about who all happens to have that exact model or that same kind of galley where it's glued on. And so I thought the best safety benefit we could get is to ask the FAA to find out where those are in the fleet and take care of it.
Okay, thank you. That's all for me.
Mr. George, I understand that the responding vehicles, the ARF responding vehicles, were FLIR equipped, and that actually did help the responders in the dark conditions?
I believe that's the case, yes.
And did they also roll some video that was helpful to us in the post-accident environment?
They did.
And I know those are things that we've encouraged other ARF responders to do, because it not only helps them in evaluation, but helps us in post-accident reconstruction efforts. I remember when this cockpit seat issue came up, I remembered the ATR in Puerto Rico, where we also had failure of the cockpit seats. This was a bounced landing in 2004, and I remember that the captain's cockpit seat failed, and he too had back injuries from that. I think that my sense was that we were hopeful, because the FAA was in the process of doing some revisions, that they would accommodate the crew seats in there. And I understand that there may be some challenges, but the mitigation of the injury, and this, isn't the first time that we've seen this here. I think especially if it's for new design or new manufactured aircraft, if there's issues with structural concerns, that those should be able to be addressed. Maybe if you're not addressing it in retrofit, fine, but going forward, it just doesn't make any sense to me. All right, any other questions from my colleagues? It's 12:08. We'll take a break until 12:15. We will come back and we will complete consideration of the report. I would request that any amendments that are anticipated by any of the board members be provided to all of the board members and the staff before we come back at 12:15. Thank you. If everyone could take their seats, we're about to start. Dr. Meyer, does the staff have any additional comments or presentations?
Yes, ma'am. I just wanted to mention that earlier in the meeting, Mr. DeLisi made a correction to something we'd said here in the meeting about what the Continental simulator did or did not display with regard to gusts and whether or not Continental had disabled a feature. With the board's permission, we want to work some similar language into the factual section of the report to make sure that it's accurately portrayed in the report.
Very well, and I believe it's the sense of the board to authorize the staff to make editorial corrections to the body of the report and any amendments that are adopted to the findings, probable cause, or conclusions to also reflect those changes within the body of the report.
Thank you.
Do any other board members have any additional comments or questions? Dr. Meyer, will you please read the findings of the investigation? If any of the board members have any questions or changes, please let me know after he has completed reading all of them.
The staff are proposing 23 conclusions. Number one, the captain and first officer were properly certificated and qualified under federal regulations to act in their respective roles during the accident flight and were experienced in the accident airplane. There is no evidence that the pilots had any condition, medical, behavioral, toxicological, or fatigue related, that might have adversely affected their performance during the accident flight. Two, the accident airplane was properly certificated, equipped, and maintained in accordance with federal regulations, was dispatched in accordance with industry practices, and was within weight and center of gravity limits. 3, no evidence indicated any pre-accident failure of the accident airplane's power plants, structures, or systems, including the nose wheel steering system. 4, the flight attendants acted appropriately when they initiated an emergency evacuation using only the exits on the left side of the airplane because of fire on the right side of the airplane. All passengers were successfully evacuated before fire entered the cabin. 5, although there was some initial confusion about the location of the accident, the timeliness of the emergency response was not a significant issue in this accident. The firefighting activities conducted by the Denver International Airport aircraft rescue and firefighting crews were effective in suppressing the exterior and interior fires. 6, given the wind-related information the pilots had, their decision to proceed with a takeoff on runway 34 right as planned was reasonable. 7, mountain wave conditions were present at the time of the accident and resulted in strong westerly winds and very localized intermittent wind gusts as high as 45 knots that crossed the airplane's path during the takeoff ground roll. 8, it is likely that the significant difference between the 11-knot winds reported by Denver International Airport's Airport Terminal Information Service broadcast and the 27-knot wind information provided to pilots by the Denver International Airport's Air Traffic Control Local Controller with their departure clearance was the result of the timing of the observations, the placement of the wind sensors, and variations in the local wind field caused by the mountain wave winds. 9, the unexpectedly strong and gusty crosswinds the airplane encountered as it accelerated during the takeoff roll made maintaining directional control during this takeoff a more difficult control task than the captain was accustomed to dealing with. However, had the captain immediately reapplied significant right rudder pedal input as the airplane was continuing its left turning motion, the airplane would not have departed the runway. 10, the captain's initiation of a rejected takeoff was delayed by about 2 to 4 seconds because he was occupied with the nose wheel steering tiller and right control wheel input, both of which were ineffective for steering the airplane. 11, if air traffic control personnel and pilots operating at airports located downwind of mountainous terrain had sufficient airport-specific information regarding the localized and transient nature of strong and gusty winds associated with mountain wave and downslope conditions, they would be able to make more informed runway selection decisions. 12, although the Denver International Airport Air Traffic Control Tower local controller followed established practices when he provided the accident pilots with the runway 34 right departure threshold wind information with their takeoff clearance, he did not provide information about the most adverse crosswind conditions that were displayed on his ribbon display terminal. Therefore, the pilots were not aware of the high winds that they would encounter during the takeoff roll. 13, if the Federal Aviation Administration had published the required letter to airmen describing the sensor locations, operational capabilities, and limitations of the low-level wind shear alert system, LWAS, at Denver International Airport, and the accident pilots had been familiar with its contents, they might have been more likely to request additional LWAS sensor wind information when they saw the clouds moving swiftly across their departure path before they accepted their takeoff clearance and/or began their takeoff roll. 14, although the departure wind information the captain received with the takeoff clearance from the Denver International Airport Air Traffic Control Tower local controller indicated that the winds were out of 270 at 27 knots, which resulted in a stronger than expected 26.2 knot crosswind component, the reported winds did not exceed Continental's maximum crosswind guidance of 33 knots, and the captain could reasonably conclude that the winds, as reported by the Denver Air Traffic Control Tower, did not exceed either his or the airplane's crosswind capabilities. 15, if the accident pilots had received the most adverse available wind information, which was displayed as airport wind on the Denver International Airport Air Traffic Control Tower local controller's ribbon display terminal, and indicated a 35-knot crosswind with 40-knot gusts, the captain would likely have decided to delay the departure or request a different runway because the resultant crosswind component exceeded Continental's 33-knot crosswind guidelines. 16, none of Denver International Airport's noise abatement procedures affected the accident airplane's departure runway assignment because the 737-500 was not considered a noise-critical airplane. 17, currently the Denver International Airport Air Traffic Control Tower runway selection policy does not clearly account for crosswind components when selecting a runway configuration. 18, because Continental's simulator training did not replicate the ground-level disturbances and gusting crosswinds that often occur at or near the runway surface, and it is unlikely that the accident captain had previously encountered gusting surface crosswinds like those he encountered on the night of the accident, the captain was not adequately prepared to respond to the changes in heading encountered during this takeoff. 19, because there are no standards for the development of enhanced crosswind guidelines for transport category airplanes, Boeing did not adequately consider the dynamic handling qualities of the Boeing 737 during takeoff or landing in strong and gusty crosswinds. It is likely that the enhanced crosswind guidelines developed by other manufacturers are similarly deficient. 20, operational flight data from U.S. airlines regarding high crosswind component encounters could help the Federal Aviation Administration develop additional strategies for reducing the risk of crosswind-related runway excursions. 21, the accident pilot's injuries would likely have been lessened or eliminated if their seats had been designed to meet the crashworthiness requirements of Title 14 Code of Federal Regulations 25.562, to which other airplane seats are designed. 22, a flight attendant jump seat that is weakened due to undetected medical fatigue could fail under the lower than expected crash loads and injure a cabin crew member who might subsequently be needed to perform critical safety duties, such as evacuating passengers. And finally, 23, the adhesive-only fastening method used for the latch plate and the aft galley of the accident airplane and similarly equipped airplane galleys was not adequate for securing galley drawers or other items of mass because it can fail over time and or with exposure to the elements.
Do we have some amendments?
Madam Chairman, I'd like to make a motion, please.
Please go for it.
And for my colleagues and staff, I refer to page 1 of the handout that we handed out during the break. I'd like to refer to finding number 10. And I would like to insert the words "and appropriate" after the word "ineffective." So therefore, finding number 10 would now read, the NTSB concludes that the captain's initiation of a rejected takeoff was delayed by about 2 to 4 seconds because he was occupied with the nose wheel steering tiller and right control wheel input, both of which were ineffective, adding the words "and inappropriate" for steering the airplane. And that is my motion.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? And I will ask the staff who have had an opportunity to review all of the amendments that are being considered at this time. As far as I know, they've had a chance to see them, and so if they have any concerns or any opposition or any suggestions for changes, I'll ask them to just speak up and get my attention. Any discussion? Member Sumwalt? All right. All in favor signal with a hand and aye. 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 5 ayes. The amendment has been adopted.
Madam Chairman, I'd like to make a motion, please. Before I do that, I'd like to ask staff a question, if I may.
Please, go ahead.
Dr. Meyer, staff revised the wording on page 84, I believe, which turned out to be a finding. So, therefore, it would seem to me that this would be a staff amendment and not one by me. I'm referring now to page 2 of my handouts, whereby when staff revised the main body of the report, they revised it, but the conclusion did not, the finding didn't get corrected in the finding. I could make the motion, but I feel that it's a staff's amendment, but I'll do that however you like. Maybe I restate what I think staff is trying to say, or why don't you read it, Dr. Meyer, however finding number 12 should read.
Do we have a motion here?
Actually, if I may, I think that is just an editorial. We did make that change in the text of the report, but when we repeated that as the conclusion, we did not make that change. That we will make that editorial correction.
Is it the sense of the board that we support making that editorial correction?
Well, the reason I want to bring it up because we vote specifically on the precise language of the finding, and so therefore I want to make sure that the board is adopting that verbiage. So perhaps I will just go ahead and.
If you'd like to make a motion, then go ahead. Then we can vote on that.
So I'm referring to finding number 12. We would strike the word. My motion is that we strike the word threshold and insert the word end in place of that. This was written by a lawyer, by the way, in lieu thereof.
Member Sumwalt has a motion at the desk for finding number 12. Is there a second?
Second.
The motion would result in finding number 12, which would now read, although the Denver International Airport Air Traffic Control Tower local controller followed established procedures when he provided the accident pilots with the runway 34 right departure end wind information with their takeoff clearance, he did not provide information about the most adverse crosswind conditions that were displayed on his ribbon display terminal. Therefore, the pilots were not aware of the high winds that they would encounter during the takeoff roll.
And Madam Chairman, you meant established practices.
Yes, thank you for catching that, Counselor. If everyone understands the draft amendment that we have in front of us, if there are any discussion. All in favor signal with a hand and aye. Aye. 5 ayes. The ayes have it. Member Sumwalt, do you have another correction?
I'm going to offer this, and I would like to know staff's input for sure on this, because in hearing the debate today, I'm not sure which way to go on this. Madam Chairman, I'd like to make a motion, please.
Member Sumwalt's recognized.
Also dealing with finding number 12, insert, nor was he required to provide after the word provide. So therefore, the motion would read, although the Denver International Airport Air Traffic Controller Tower local controller followed established, is that word practices? Okay, I just wanted to make sure. I wasn't sure what the general counsel was correcting us on. Followed established practices when he provided the accident pilots with runway 34 right departure and wind information and their takeoff clearance. He did not provide, and I'm suggesting, nor was he required to provide information about the most adverse crosswind conditions that were displayed on his ribbon display terminal. Therefore, the pilots were not aware of the high winds that they would encounter during the takeoff roll. And there is my motion.
Second.
Seconded by Vice Chairman Hart. It sounds like the member Sumwalt has a motion at the desk as read and is seeking staff comment.
Yes, Dan and I have discussed. Staff has one minor comment, and I think this responds to your question, Member Sumwalt, as to the content of the report in our discussion today. As Mr. Bartlett noted, there was some discrepancy between the Denver Tower SOP and established local practice, and we were not able to get a clear reconciliation from the FAA. We would suggest a very minor change to your addition to state, nor was he clearly required to provide, which would more accurately reflect the discrepancy in the information we received from the FAA.
I would certainly support that, but I want to make sure that staff is comfortable with that, because after hearing Mr. Bartlett speak a little while ago, I think you indicated that the controller should provide any and all information that might help a pilot. I'm taking liberty with your words, but I wanted to make sure that if there was no clear guidance for the controller, that we were indicating that there was no specific requirement for that, instead of just leaving it as if he failed to do something that he was required to do. And it bothered me that it was currently written the way that it could be interpreted that way.
I think staff agrees that this was certainly not an individual case of a controller failing to provide something. Would you agree with that, Dan?
I would agree to that. And in the controller's defense, this air traffic controller on this evening was giving everybody the airport wind well beyond what would normally be expected or required.
Well, thank you for the reaffirmation of that, because I did have some apprehension after hearing your discussion. I will be glad to accept staff's friendly amendment there, or friendly suggestion there. So therefore, Madam Chairman, I will revise my motion to say, nor was he clearly required to provide.
We have a motion to modify finding number 12 to insert, nor was he clearly required to provide, after he did not provide, nor was he clearly required to provide information about the most adverse crosswind conditions. All in favor signal with a hand and aye.
I'm still discussing.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
But I'm still confused, because it was my understanding that the written policy requires it. The operational daily way they actually did it didn't require it. Am I clear on that?
No, the Tower Standard Operating Procedure for Denver says that aircraft departing Denver will be issued airport wind.
Okay, is that an operating practice, or is that a written document?
That is a written document, and it contradicts the operating practice.
Okay, so the written document requires that the operating practice, as a matter of daily routine, they didn't do it.
Correct.
Okay, so it sounds to me like it is required, at least by the written document. That's where I'm confused.
Vice Chairman, if I could add, just in my mind, the way I clarified that discrepancy was that the written procedure, which did say to issue airport wind, in advance of the accident, perhaps if we had gone to Denver and pointed that out, what might have changed was their written procedure. They may have written their procedure to be issuing threshold wind, instead of being convinced in advance of the accident to actually be issuing airport wind. So technically there was a piece of paper that wasn't correct with the common practice, but I resolved that as saying they would have corrected the piece of paper. They wouldn't have changed the whole practice.
Okay, I guess I'm just troubled with, given the document that says he's required to do it, with saying he's not required to do it. That's where I'm tripping.
If it may help, Vice Chairman Hart, there are other documents as well that also address the issue of issuing winds, and that's addressed on page 34 in the report. The Standard Operating Procedure Manual at Denver made that statement, but other references that it refers to in the 711065 and in the and when we talk about when we talk about common practice at the tower, this is not the type of thing that the line controllers make up. This was, directed by their management, by their supervisory personnel. So the individual controller who we are referencing in finding number 12 would certainly have direction that what he issued on the night of the accident would be correct according to his facility management and other directives. The local Standard Operating Procedure Manual is most likely what needed to be updated.
Was there anything in writing aside from issuing airport winds to departing aircraft? Did they have anything in writing that said that he should issue threshold departure end winds?
Negative.
I see the Vice Chairman's conundrum a little bit.
Yeah.
Member Sumwalt, I think that the finding that staff wrote originally established that the local procedures and practices, that he was being consistent with those. It does sound like there's a lot of confusion, and therein lies the problem. I understand what the Vice Chairman is also saying, because we say required. Well, the only written document that we have actually tended to lean towards the requiring them to issue it. They just weren't doing it. No one was doing it.
May I ask a question? Okay, just yes or no answer here. Was the controller required to provide information about the most adverse crosswind condition that were displayed on his ribbon display terminal?
Negative.
Yes or no?
Negative.
Okay.
I guess the way I make those work together, because it's apparently confusing me, I guess the way what you're saying is the written document says report the airport winds. This isn't talking about the airport winds. This is talking about the most adverse crosswind conditions. And what you're saying is there is no written or otherwise requirement to report the most adverse crosswind conditions. There is a written requirement to report the airport winds, but that's different than what we're saying here. Okay, I can go with that then.
But the airport winds happen to be the most adverse crosswind that were displayed on his terminal.
By coincidence, in this particular case, they may not always be.
Right.
All right. So.
Okay, I'm ready to vote then. I understand it now.
You want to proceed?
So I call for the question.
Okay. All in favor of the amendment offered by Member Sumwalt, which reads, nor was he clearly required to provide signal with a hand and eye. 4 ayes, 1 nay. The ayes have it. Do we have another finding, Member Sumwalt?
Yes, Madam Chairman. On page 5 of my handout, I have I'd like to offer a new finding. That would actually be on page 4. I'd like to propose a new finding that says the captain's use of tiller and full right control wheel in the 3 seconds before the excursion likely resulted from acute stress stemming from a sudden, unexpected threat, perceived lack of control, and extreme time pressure. And that is my motion. I've taken that directly out of the verbiage in the report.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Discussion? Member Sumwalt, do you have any discussion?
No discussion, Madam Chairman, other than feeling like I felt that since staff did revise it last week, I felt that did rise to the level of being a finding, since it helps to explain why those, at least by our analysis, why those control inputs were made or could have been made.
Any other discussion from the board members? All in favor of additional findings, signal with the hand and aye. Aye. 5 ayes. The ayes have it. We have an additional finding that staff will insert in the appropriate location in the draft. Any additional changes to the conclusions, to the findings?
At the risk of arousing the ire of lots of people, I have one word that I would like to look at, and that is in page 105, finding number 9. At the end of the finding, it says the airplane would not have departed the runway. It's talking about if he had been more accustomed to this and had applied the significant right rudder pedal, that the airplane would not have departed the runway. I thought that was a little strong and would suggest replacing would with may not have departed the runway.
Okay, so do we have a motion?
That's my motion, to replace the word would on page 105, line 20, with the word may.
Second? Do we have a second? I'll second it for purposes of discussion. Member Hart, would you like to discuss?
Yeah, I just thought that was kind of strong to say for sure it wouldn't have left the runway. Maybe it would, maybe it wouldn't have. I thought all we could really say with any confidence was that it may not have left the runway.
I think staff said there was adequate control authority to have kept the airplane on the runway, in which case it would not have left the runway had the control been applied at the proper time.
Staff, I'd be interested in your comments for this last minute change that you haven't thought about ahead of time, but any thoughts?
Well, we're discussing this a little bit here. I think part of our discomfort would be that last sentence is phrased as the airplane was continuing its left turning motion. So since that's not a specific point, we would have to do some discussion to figure out when would change to may. I mean, we had, as we discussed in the presentations and briefings, shown that the airplane had sufficient rudder authority to maintain the maintain the runway center line. We were not able to establish a point of no return, if you will, and weren't attempting to, but we were able to establish that the airplane had the rudder authority to maintain the runway center line. So at some point there is a point of no return, but we weren't able to determine that. But we can safely say that the airplane could have maintained the center line. It did have the authority to do that. So
well, I think if the airplane can maintain the center line, then it's not going to depart the runway.
Correct. So I think that's why we went with would, that we definitely did have that control authority.
And that's certainly fair. My issue was not with the airplane's capability. I understood that. My issue was with, under these circumstances, is the pilot going to do everything necessary to keep this puppy where it's supposed to be? That's all I was saying.
Certainly understand that, Vice Chairman Hart, and I think that's addressed with the entire phrase, had the captain immediately reapplied significant right rudder pedal. It doesn't make a claim as to whether he was able to, due to whatever factors that we did discuss earlier, but had he maintained or immediately reapplied the significant right rudder pedal, then the authority did exist. I think that's what that entire phrase is saying.
Okay, so the horror story I'm imagining is a pilot-induced oscillation that he applied too much, for example, and now he's back and forth, and maybe he's not going to stay on the runway. That's what I'm thinking. I'm not going to lose sleep over it, but I'm just proposing it as a motion.
Right. We did not analyze that situation, as that was not occurring.
If I might add, that's why we were very careful to look at that period where we felt the wind extraction would be valid, and that was the 14 seconds after the airspeed came alive. And I think up until that point, we believe that had the captain put in sufficient right rudder, the airplane would have maintained center line. And that's what we're speaking to here. Beyond that, we did not try to find that point of no return.
If I might add, Vice Chairman Hart, I do think that by saying had he immediately reapplied significant right rudder, I understand that perhaps you might be thinking about a different solution to this accident, which could have been one in which it was over-controlled, in which he got back to the center line but left the rudder pedal in there and veered off the right side of the runway. There is perhaps a different solution that could have happened had he still corrected the airplane back. I think what we meant in this finding was that had he reapplied the proper amount of right rudder, the airplane would not have departed the runway. By saying significant right rudder, that may not preclude him getting into a situation where he makes other inappropriate inputs later on during the roll.
Okay, well, I probably used all the IR points I've got for the last 6 months, so I'm going to just drop it there.
Vice Chairman Hart withdraws his motion, or we're going to vote on it.
I'll withdraw it.
Okay. Any additional discussion or proposed changes? Is there a motion to adopt the findings as revised?
So moved.
All in favor signal with a hand and aye. 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 5 ayes. The ayes have it. The findings have been adopted. Dr. Meyer, will you please read the probable cause as presented in the draft report?
The National Transportation Safety Board determines that the probable cause of this accident was the captain's cessation of right rudder input, which was needed to maintain directional control of the airplane about 4 seconds before the excursion, when the airplane encountered a strong and gusty crosswind that exceeded the captain's training and experience. Contributing to the accident were the following factors. 1, an air traffic control system that did not require or facilitate the dissemination of key available wind information to the air traffic controllers and pilots. And 2, inadequate crosswind training in the airline industry due to deficient simulator wind gust modeling.
Is there discussion?
Madam Chairman, I move that we accept the probable cause as presented.
All in favor signal with a hand and aye. 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 The ayes have it. 5 ayes. The probable cause has been adopted as presented. Dr. Meyer, will you please read the safety recommendations? If any of the board members have any questions or comments, please let me know when he has finished reading all of the recommendations.
Staff are proposing 14 recommendations to the Federal Aviation Administration. Number 1, conduct research into and document the effects of mountain wave and downslope conditions at airports such as Denver International Airport that are located downwind of mountainous terrain, including, for example, airports in or near Colorado Springs, Colorado, Anchorage, Alaska, Salt Lake City, Utah, and Reno, Nevada. Identify potential mountain wave-related hazards to ground operations at those airports, and disseminate the results to pilots and airport air traffic control personnel to allow for more informed runway selection decisions. 2, archive all low-level wind shear alert system, LWAS, data obtained from Denver International Airport and other airports that experience similar wind conditions, and make that data available for additional research and the potential future development of an improved LWAS algorithm for crosswind and gusty wind alerts on air traffic control tower ribbon display terminals. 3, modify Federal Aviation Administration Order 7110.65 to require air traffic controllers at airports with multiple sources of wind information to provide pilots with the maximum wind component, including gusts, that the flight could encounter. 4, review the required documentation for all low-level wind shear alert system, LWAS, equipped air traffic control towers to ensure that a letter to airmen has been published and is easily accessible, describing the location and designation of the remote sensors, the capabilities and limitations of the system, and the availability of current LWAS remote sensor wind information on the request of a pilot, in compliance with Federal Aviation Administration Order 7210.3. 5, require air traffic controllers to locally develop and implement written runway selection programs that proactively consider current and developing wind conditions and include clearly defined crosswind components, including wind gusts, when considering operational advantage with respect to runway selection. 6, gather data on surface winds at a sample of major U.S. airports, including Denver International Airport, when high wind conditions and significant gusts are present, and use that data to develop realistic gusty crosswind profiles for use in airline pilot simulator training programs. 7, require Title 14 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 121 and 135 operators to incorporate the realistic gusty crosswind profiles developed as a result of Safety Recommendation 6 into their pilot simulator training programs. 8. Once realistic gusty crosswind profiles as asked for in Safety Recommendation 6 are develop a standard methodology, including pilot-in-the-loop testing, for transport category airplane manufacturers to establish empirically based type-specific maximum gust and crosswind guidelines for transport category airplanes that account for wind gusts. 9. Once a methodology as asked for in Safety Recommendation 8 has been developed, require manufacturers of transport category airplanes to develop type-specific maximum crosswind takeoff guidelines that account for wind gusts. 10. Until the actions described in Safety Recommendation 9 are accomplished, require manufacturers of transport category airplanes to provide operators with interim crosswind takeoff guidelines that account for wind gusts. 11. Work with U.S. airline operators to review and analyze operational flight data to identify factors that contribute to encounters with excessive crosswinds and use this information to develop and implement additional strategies for reducing the likelihood of wind-related runway excursions. 12. Require cockpit crew seats installed in newly manufactured airplanes that were type certificated before 1988 to meet the crashworthiness standards contained in Title 14 Code of Federal Regulations 25.562. 13. Require operators to perform periodic inspections on the Burns Aerospace Model 2501-5 jump seats for fatigue cracks within the jump seat structure and replace the jump seat if fatigue cracks are found. And 14. Require that operators of transport category airplanes that use galley latches or latch plates secured solely by adhesives that may degrade over time modify the latches to include mechanical fasteners.
Are there any additional recommendations or amendments at the desk? Go ahead.
Madam Chairman, I'd like to make a motion, please.
Member Sumwalt's recognized for the purposes of making a motion.
Madam Chairman, my motion is that on recommendation number 6, on line 13, it uses the word airline in reference to airline pilot. I propose that we strike the word airline, and so that the recommendation 6 would now read, gather data on surface winds at a sample of major U.S. airports, including Denver International Airport, when high wind conditions and significant gusts are present, and use that data to develop realistic gusty crosswind profiles for use in pilot simulator training programs. There is my motion.
Second.
Discussion?
Madam Chairman, I recognize that there's a pilot community out there outside of airline piloting, and I think that we should not just limit this to airline pilots. There's a lot of Part 91 and Part 91K and 135 operators that are not considered to be airline pilots, and so therefore, in the spirit of an equivalent level of safety or one level of safety, that would be the desire of my motion as such. Thank you.
One minor comment. I believe it's these data instead of that data.
I could certainly go with that. Which way is it written in the draft?
I believe he's correct, and that can be handled with an editorial change by staff or correction by staff.
Okay. We'll incorporate these into the recommendation for sake of making sure that we're grammatically correct. And Member Sumwalt's motion deleting airline from recommendation number 6 is pending. Call the question. All in favor signal with a hand and aye. Aye. The ayes have it. 5 ayes. Recommendation 6 has been modified. Member Sumwalt's recognized.
Thank you. How did you know I was going to do that? I'm referring now to page 6 of my handouts, and Madam Chairman, I'd like to make a motion that on recommendation number 7, we strike out the word and, insert a comma, and then the number. Well, bottom line is I want to add part 91K. How does that sound? So that the motion would now read, recommendation 7 would now read, require 14 CFR Part 121, 135, and 91K operators to incorporate the realistic gusty crosswind profiles developed as a result of the safety recommendation number 6, the one that we just read, into their pilot simulator training programs. There is my motion.
Second. Any discussions? And maybe I just say for discussion purposes, we've been down this road before, and so if staff could just take note, these amendments, we want to be consistent. I think when 121, 135, 91K. Let's just make sure when we go through our recs that we're incorporating all three. We have a history of doing that. We've kind of telegraphed a board preference on that issue, and so we shouldn't really be in a situation where we have to offer amendments anymore on that. So let's just make sure we're cross-checking our amendments. All in favor signal with the hand and aye. 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 5 ayes. Recommendation number 7 has been revised. I have an amendment at the desk on recommendation 8. I propose to amend recommendation 8 by striking the word guidelines where it appears and replace with limitations. This has to do with recommendations to the manufacturers about developing limitations for crosswind landings, takeoffs. So I think we've discussed this earlier. We've discussed whose responsibility this is, why we think it's important, and again, it establishes a hard limit, a do not exceed for crews. Crews are used to limitations when it comes to other wind components, tailwind components, other things that they do in the course of their work. Other manufacturers actually establish crosswind limitations. I jump seated last week in 2 Airbus aircraft. They pulled out their manual. They showed me it was in the limitations section of their AFM. So I think that we want to set the bar high. We want to provide them with as much authority as possible in the cockpit. It's up to the recipients of our recommendations to determine how they want to adopt them, but we're asking the FAA to put some consistency forward in this area. So I have a recommendation 8. And you know what? I probably violated could I get a second on my motion?
I seconded it earlier. You just didn't hear me.
Is there any discussion from other board members?
I'm concerned about changing it from guidelines to limitations because unlike the things that are typically limitations, as the staff said, they really are hard stops. This one is not a hard stop, and it depends heavily on lots of factors, not the least of which is the pilot's competence. It also depends on the runway condition, depends on lots of things. And my concern is that if we call it a limitation, then yes, it will be a hard stop, but the other side of that coin is that if someone sees a 35 knot limitation and it's only 32, oh, well, so I'm good to go because it is a limitation and I'm not there yet, so I'm going to do it. So my concern is that's the common meaning of limitation in this industry is that's just, the common meaning of guideline is that's just the number I need to know about versus limitation, which means if it's not up to the limitation, I can do it. So I'm concerned about replacing guidelines with limitations in that context.
Vice Chairman, when someone sees a limitation, when someone sees a guideline and the guideline's for 35 and they get 32, do they not do it?
Just speaking from my personal experience, when I see demonstrated crosswind component, which is the way it's typically described for general aviation airplanes, demonstrated crosswind component 20, that doesn't necessarily, that number gives me a context in which to consider that information, but it doesn't necessarily mean that if under certain situations it's 22 knots, I'm not going to do it, or if it's 18 knots, I am going to do it. Whereas if it's a limitation, then that's a hard stop that is more likely to create exactly that result, which I think could be the wrong result for some people who aren't competent or who are on a slippery runway and shouldn't be shouldn't be going up to the, quote, limitation. By the way, that's interesting you say that you found it in the Airbus book in the limitation section, because that's one of the numbers that I have the most trouble finding, because nobody knows what to call it, because it typically is not a limitation. Most of the books I look at, it's not in the limitation section. Some it is, but it's still not called. But it's still called demonstrated crosswind component. It doesn't have the word limitation on it.
And it did say demonstrated crosswind component, but it was in the limitations section of their handbook. And I think this is exactly where the confusion lies. And my concern was that the staff conveyed to us when they pulled some of the pilots about what guidelines meant to them. There were crew who thought that it was okay to go past what the guideline information was. And I think one of the challenges that we have is needing to get some consistency with this information, with good guidance from the FAA about what standards should be, what information should be conveyed, and how it should be conveyed, and consistency between manufacturers and operators. And I think that limitations potentially does set the bar high, but I think that's what we're in the business of doing. And if there's a good reason why they don't want to go that direction, then I think we'd certainly entertain that. But we do have some who are providing limitations, and it needs to be more consistent. Does staff have some thoughts on this issue?
Yeah. Recommendation number 10, which is more of an interim fix, talks about adding the gustiness onto the current guidelines. That's a step that we think should be taken immediately. Recommendation number 8, we think, does support a more thorough methodology to build a limitation. First, we're going to ask for gusty crosswind profiles to be developed. Then we're looking for a standard methodology, including pilot in the loop, to figure out what a realistic limitation, empirically based, ought to be. So we do think that that is a thorough and robust process that over time may eventually result in something that we all in the industry can agree is a limitation. In the meantime, while that's being developed, let's get the guidelines right now modified to account for gusts.
And if I could build on that, beyond the speeds that we're talking about here, where we do have hard and fast numbers, every number has some uncertainty to it. We're just asking in the case, the crosswind limit versus a guideline, I think it takes some of that fuzziness out of the number. For example, stall speeds. You got to define an entry rate, a load factor. That's actually the number quoted has all kinds of conditions associated with it because it's fuzzy. It's not exact, and that's kind of what we're trying to do with crosswind, I think, when we go from guideline to limitation. So I think it's actually a positive thing.
I thought I'd add one point, which is that I think that the crosswind guidelines, or the demonstrated crosswind for both Boeing and Airbus, are listed in the limitations section, but I don't think either one is considered an operating limitation by the FAA, just for a clarifying point.
Well, I flew for an airline that took the manufacturer's limitation and then made it an airline-specific limitation, so it was a limitation. If I busted an airline limitation, that was as good as busting a manufacturer's or an FAA limit. I was required to know that, and I was required to adhere to it. And so what I want to know is, what do we gain by making it a hard limit, and what do we lose? That's really what the debate is here, I think. And so I'd like to hear that. I don't see the harm in making it a hard limit, but I'd like to hear other opinions.
My concern is that the harm is that someone who shouldn't be going up to the limitation says, okay, if that's the limit, I can do it, so I'm going to do it, and that could be a mistake. That's my concern, is that someone who's not competent or who's not considering the fact that the runway is slippery or whatever is going to look at that limitation and say, well, if they say I can do it, I guess I can do it, so I'm going to do it. And that's my concern of the harm.
A limitation is a max. The pilot still has to apply judgment as to when to go to that limitation.
Yeah, that's true. We've seen a lot of pilots in recent accidents who aren't doing so hot in that department. So,
can I just add, I think besides consistency, this adds clarity, because that was the thing we heard about the guidelines. There are a lot of different interpretations of that, so this one is consistent and clear. And I think it has to be taken in the context of the recommendation, which is these are profiles based on a standard methodology that are going to be empirically based. that's where they're going to come from. And so that consistency and clarity is going to be data-driven.
I think there's still a potential for some ambiguity because, as Vice Chairman Hart said, a limitation can be implied to be an expectation. You have to be able to take the airplane, or you have to be able to do it up to that limitation. The other comment I would make is simply a limitation generally is this is how far the capability of the airplane goes. In this case, it's with the pilot in the loop, it's how far the airplane can go and how far the pilot can go. The question is which pilot? Are we going to do this with flight test pilots? Are we going to do this with an average pilot? Or are we going to do it with a 10 percentile pilot? So in each case, you're going to get a different, quote, limitation, unquote. I'm not against this, but I think then we really have to emphasize the development of a standard methodology, because the methodology is going to define where this, quote, limitation ends up to be.
Any additional comments or discussion? And just so you know, I have an amendment to number 9 that's the same. So, and for a penny and for a pound here, all in favor of striking the word guidelines where it appears and replacing with limitations, and recommendation 8, signal with the hand and aye. 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 4 ayes, nays? Nay. 1 nay. The amendment has been adopted. I also have an amendment for recommendation number 9 that strikes the word guidelines and replaces with limitation. I move to strike the word guidelines in recommendation 9 and replace with limitations. Second. Do we need additional discussion on this one? This one is once a methodology is asked for, as asked for in safety recommendation 8 has been developed, require manufacturers of transport category airplanes to develop type-specific maximum crosswind takeoff limitations that account for wind gusts. Discussion? Seeing none, all in favor signal with the hand and aye. 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 Nays? Nay. 3 ayes, 2 nays. The nays are Vice Chairman Hart and Member Weiner. The amendment has been adopted. Are there any additional items for discussion in the recommendations section? Member Sumwalt.
Yes, Madam Chairman. Before we broke, I talked about the ARF response, and I was asking, are we satisfied with that, with the process? And I think staff has had a chance to look at it. Mr. DeLisi or Mr. English, if you all could tell the board what you've discussed.
Yes, thanks for the opportunity to collect our thoughts during the break. In this particular accident, the initial controller that reported the location misspoke. Within a few seconds of misspeaking, he recognized that mistake. He then was technologically challenged in correcting that. He didn't know the proper use of the crash phone, so he was unable to correct his initial misspeak for a period of about 30 seconds. Dan has assured us that training has taken place at Denver now so that everyone knows the correct use of that phone. So therefore, we didn't really see that this was an accident related to the other ones that prompted the recommendations about a crash detection system. This was more a case of a simple misspeak that took a little while to get corrected.
I understand that. In the Little Rock accident, there was a misspeak or a hear-back error where the controller said it's off the departure end, and the ARF crews thought that meant the approach end or something, so therefore they went to the wrong end. So I hear what you're saying. I'm not impressed that somebody would be like me, technologically challenged, trying to use the crash phone, but I appreciate your explanation, and I offer no further recommendations based on what I've just heard from you. Thank you.
Any other comments or amendments from my colleagues? Is there a motion to adopt the recommendations as revised?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor signal with a hand and aye.
Aye.
5 ayes. The recommendations have been adopted as revised. We will now vote on adopting the report in whole. Is there a motion to adopt the report as revised?
So moved.
All in favor signal with a hand and aye. The report has been unanimously adopted as revised. Is there any board member who wishes to file a concurring or dissenting statement? Seeing none. Well, I think we probably beat the staff predictions for the board meeting with 5 new board members, and so I would like to thank my colleagues and for their hard work and their preparation for the board meeting, both in meeting with staff in advance of the board meeting as well as for their work in the boardroom. And thank you to all of you who have joined us for today's meeting. I'd like to also recognize our hardworking staff. I know that I speak on behalf of all of the board members that we very much appreciate the work of all of our staff, particularly today those in the Office of Aviation Safety. The board members get to sit on the dais and talk about the report and ask questions about it, but it's the staff who've worked tirelessly for the last 18 months putting this product together and producing an excellent report with many valuable recommendations for us. I know that some of you all had to give up valuable time with your family in December of 2008 when you launched to this accident. And so thank you for your sacrifices in the weeks immediately following the accident. Thank you very much for your long work and your commitment. One point that I did want to follow up on, as we discussed earlier, I think an accurate and comprehensive analysis of the airplane's performance was ultimately developed. But improved cooperation would have resulted in a more efficient investigation. We look forward to working with the aircraft manufacturing community in the future in this regard so that information is shared with us as we investigate the accident, with all of us having an eye towards improving aviation safety. You know, we all have a role to play in aviation safety. The captain in the left seat does have the responsibility, the ultimate responsibility for the safety of his ship. But he or she should not be the only one in the system with the sword of Damocles hanging over their head. From the birth of an aircraft, design assumptions are made about how to safely take off in various conditions, from calm to gusty. But those are those assumptions conveyed by manufacturers to operators and understood by pilots. Are carriers training their crews to execute such maneuvers? Likewise, what information is gathered by the sensors, displayed to the air traffic controllers, and conveyed to the pilots? Or is something left out here and there, or maybe not provided because everyone thinks that a safety margin is built in somewhere? Whose job is it to decide how much wind is too much wind, or which information is important? How many of the margins got snipped just a little bit at each turn and the buck was passed until the captain didn't have any margin left? He needed to be perfect and perhaps omniscient to predict the winds and respond accordingly. Although this captain had been trained well, had an outstanding record, and had plenty of experience, on that day it wasn't enough. The accident was memorable, but it wasn't a great human tragedy. So there is no hue and cry to change the status quo at Denver or anywhere else for that matter. But it is critical that we don't let the lack of fatalities fuel pushback for the safety recommendations that we're proposing today. It seems like not much has changed in the 18 months since Continental 1404 veered off the runway. I recognize change is difficult. It requires looking at things differently, breaking poor habits, implementing new procedures. It requires ownership, individually and collectively, day in and day out, not just of ourselves, but of the entire system. Yet change does not happen without leadership. As businessman and philanthropist Warren Buffett has said, someone is sitting in the shade today because someone planted a tree long ago. I'm hopeful that in light of the findings, probable cause determination, and recommendations adopted by the board today, each of us, manufacturers, pilots, operators, and regulators, will embrace change and plant the seeds for a safety system that will shade us all in the years to come. This meeting is adjourned.